Football is often celebrated as America's game, a stage where athletes rise to glory under the bright lights of Sunday afternoons and Super Bowl nights. But behind the touchdowns, behind the cheers, behind the flawless highlights that live forever in our memories, there exists another story. It is a story hidden in shadows, written not by the heroes who played within the rules, but by the ones who stepped outside of them. It is the story of illegal moves, the tactics so ruthless, so dangerous, or so effective that they were eventually banished from the game. Yet their impact never disappeared. Instead, they shaped football into what it is today. To watch the old films is to glimpse a different sport. In grainy black and white, you see defenders throwing clothesline tackles that snapped ball carriers to the ground. You see linemen getting slapped across the side of the head so violently that their helmets nearly spin. You see receivers pulled to the turf by their face masks, or defenders lunging crown first, using their helmets as weapons. These moments look shocking to us now, but at the time they were part of football's evolution, part of a brutal experiment in what the human body could endure. Consider the head slap. Deacon Jones, one of the most feared defensive players in NFL history, perfected it. With one thunderous swing of his hand to the helmet of an offensive lineman, he disrupted vision, balance, and concentration. Quarterbacks became sitting targets. To Jones, it was an art form, the key to his dominance. To his opponents, it was torment. The NFL eventually banned the move in the late 1970s, calling it unsafe and unfair. But by then, Jones had already carved his name into history as the master of the outlaw pass rush. Then there was stickum, a substance as infamous as it was effective. Fred Biletnikoff used it to secure his catches in the 1970s. Lester Hayes covered his arms with it in the 1980s, turning every interception into an inevitability. Wide receivers caught passes with impossible ease. Defensive backs turned errant throws into turnovers. For years, it was tolerated, even laughed about. But when its impact became undeniable, the NFL banned stickum in 1981. The ban did not erase the legacy of those who used it. Instead, it forced receivers and defenders alike to develop new skills. Hands had to become stronger, technique sharper. The outlaw era left its mark, but some moves were not about skill. They were about survival, about desperation. The horse collar tackle is one of the most brutal examples. In the early 2000s, Roy Williams of the Dallas Cowboys made it his signature. Reaching from behind, he would yank players down by the inside collar of their shoulder pads. Legs twisted, ankles snapped, careers changed in an instant. Terrell Owens, one of the league's biggest stars, was sidelined by one of those tackles. Fans watched helplessly as bodies crumpled, and finally, in 2005, the NFL banned it. Another outlaw tactic gone, but only after too much damage had been done. The truth is that football's rulebook has never been proactive. It has always been reactive. Every new regulation, every outlawed tactic has come after chaos. The clothesline was banned only after too many broken bones. The chop block was outlawed after it left too many linemen without knees. Spearing where defenders launched helmet first into opponents became illegal only after concussions piled up. The league did not predict these dangers. It responded to them, one broken body at a time. And then there are the scandals, the moments when illegality went beyond a single move and infected an entire culture. The most infamous example is Bountygate. In 2012, the New Orleans Saints were exposed for operating a bounty system that rewarded players with cash for injuring opponents. It was not a single outlaw tactic. It was a strategy built on violence, a scheme that shook the image of the league. Coaches were suspended. Players were punished. But the damage was already there, a reminder that football's dark side was not limited to individual actions. It could be institutional, systemic, and far-reaching. Illegal moves have always lived in this space between genius and brutality. They are often celebrated by fans in the moment, admired for their effectiveness, remembered as clever or ruthless. But in the aftermath, they carry scars. For every legendary highlight made possible by an outlaw move, there was a player on the other end left hurting, sometimes permanently. This is the paradox at the heart of football's history. The moves that were too dangerous to survive were also the ones that shaped the game most profoundly. Without them, offenses and defenses do not evolve. Without them, strategies remain stagnant. Without them, football never becomes the high-speed chess match it is today. Think about the way offensive linemen learned to adapt after the head slap was banned. Think about how receivers refined their routes after Stickum disappeared. Think about how defenders adjusted their tackling form when spearing and horse collar tackles were outlawed. Every illegal move forced an adjustment, forced growth, forced the sport to take a step forward. And yet, every step forward came at a cost. A broken neck here, a torn ligament there, a concussion that never healed. Every outlaw tactic was eventually erased, but only after it had taken its toll. The history of football's illegal moves is not written in ink. It is written in scars, in lost seasons, in careers cut short. When we look back at the early decades of football, we see a raw and unpolished game where players relied on brute force and survival instincts. Over time, as more outlaw moves emerged, the league tightened its rules. Each change sculpting the modern NFL. But to tell the story of football without acknowledging those dark chapters would be dishonest. The game we love today was born not just from glory, but from danger. This documentary will uncover that story. It will reveal the outlaw tactics that changed the rulebook. It will highlight the players who used them, the opponents who suffered from them, and the league that was forced to adapt because of them. From the devastating clothesline tackles of the 1950s to the technical cheating of the 1970s to the scandals of the modern era, every chapter will show how football was reshaped by those who broke its rules. The NFL has always promoted its heroes. The quarterbacks who throw perfect spirals, the receivers who make impossible catches, the defenders who deliver highlight hits within the rules. But hidden beneath that celebration is another group of men. They are the innovators who discovered shortcuts, who found advantages where none should exist, who blurred the line between fair and foul. They are the ones who forced the league to change. And that is the key. Football's most illegal moves are not just mistakes, they are milestones. They are the invisible fingerprints on today's game. They remind us that progress does not come cleanly. It comes through trial, through error, through pain, and through reform. As you watch this story unfold, you will see how every outlaw move carried its own legacy. Some made players legends, some sparked outrage, some ended careers. But all of them left behind a mark. Football is a sport of beauty and brutality, of strategy and survival. And nothing reveals that balance more than the history of its illegal moves. Because the NFL is not built only on the plays we celebrate. It is built on the ones we erased. The outlaw tactics, the broken rules. The moments we no longer see, but whose echoes still shape every whistle, every flag, and every Sunday. Football is America's game. But America's game was written in shadows as much as in light. And now it is time to step into those shadows. The NFL is not just a game. It is a billion-dollar empire, a cultural heartbeat, and for millions, a weekly ritual that defines autumn Sundays. But behind the spectacle of modern broadcasts, behind the crisp helmets and perfectly manicured fields, lies a story that is far less polished. It is a story of bending rules, of breaking them outright, and of how every illegal move, every gray area exploited. Every loophole tested has shaped the game we know today. From its earliest years, football was never meant to be static. The rulebook was always under pressure, always being rewritten in real time. Players, coaches, and even owners were not simply participants in the game. They were architects of its future, constantly probing the limits of what was allowed and what could be gotten away with. Every illegal hit, every trick formation, every controversial tactic forced the NFL to evolve. And in many cases, those moves, once considered outlawed, became part of the DNA of the sport. That is what this film is about. The hidden legacy of illegal moves in the NFL. How chaos became order. How controversy became innovation. And how the shadows of the game have shaped the bright lights we see on Sundays. To understand this legacy, we need to begin with the essence of football itself. Football was born in violence, in collisions, in the raw pursuit of advantage. At the turn of the 20th century, when the game was closer to rugby than today's sleek spectacle, rules were often little more than suggestions. Tackles above the shoulders, dangerous pileups. Brutal flying wedges where players locked arms and hurled themselves forward like human battering rams. These were not exceptions. They were strategy, and they came at a cost. In the early 1900s, dozens of players died from injuries sustained on the field. Newspapers ran headlines asking if the game itself should be banned. The outcry was so severe that President Theodore Roosevelt intervened in 1905, demanding reforms to save the sport from extinction. The result was the formation of the NCAA Rules Committee, and later, the professional game's adoption of stricter guidelines. Out went the flying wedge. In came the forward pass. Safety measures were introduced not because of foresight, but because illegal tactics had pushed the sport to its breaking point. What nearly destroyed football ended up reshaping it. That pattern of illegal moves, forcing the evolution of the rulebook, would repeat itself again and again across NFL history. In the 1930s and 40s, trick plays blurred the line between creativity and deception. Players used hidden ball tricks, sleight of hand, even uniform alterations to disguise who had the football. Some tactics were outlawed as unsportsmanlike. Others became celebrated innovations. The Statue of Liberty play, the flea flicker. Moves born in the gray area between cheating and brilliance. By the 1950s and 60s, as the NFL grew into America's game, the battle between legality and illegality took on new dimensions. Defensive backs grabbed, shoved, and outright tackled receivers long before the ball arrived. Offensive linemen held defenders with impunity. Coaches like Paul Brown and Vince Lombardi pushed officiating to its limits, demanding clarity in rules that often did not yet exist. The NFL found itself writing and rewriting regulations to keep pace with the inventiveness, audacity of its participants. And then came the era of violence. The 1970s NFL was defined by brutal hits and intimidation. The Oakland Raiders, the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Dallas Cowboys, they built dynasties not just on talent, but on a willingness to cross lines. Clothesline tackles, headhunting safeties. Late hits designed to send a message. The league penalized, but often looked the other way. Fans loved the spectacle. Television ratings soared. Once again, illegal moves shaped not just the play on the field, but the culture of the league itself. But every shadow leaves a mark. The very tactics that thrilled audiences also left players broken. Concussions, shattered bones, shortened careers. These became the quiet cost of a sport that celebrated bending the rules. Decades later, as science revealed the long-term impact of head trauma, the NFL would be forced into yet another reckoning. The illegal hits of the 70s and 80s are now seen not as entertaining highlights, but as harbingers of the concussion crisis that still haunts the league. This is why the story of illegal moves matters. Because the history of the NFL is not just the history of great plays and legendary champions. It is the history of where the line was drawn, who crossed it, and how those moments changed the future of the game. In this film, we will travel through that history decade by decade, scandal by scandal, innovation by innovation. We will examine the most notorious moves that shaped the league, from the clothesline tackles that ended careers, to the subtle art of holding that still defines trench warfare in the NFL, from Spygate and Deflategate in the modern era, to the shadowy underworld of bounty systems where players were paid to injure opponents. we will hear from the voices of those who lived it. The legends who exploited the loopholes, the opponents who suffered from them, the referees who struggled to enforce ever-changing rules, and the fans whose appetite for violence and drama often encouraged players to go further, to hit harder, to test the limits once again. The rule breakers of the NFL were not just villains, they were catalysts. They forced the game to evolve, to adapt, to survive. In many cases, they made the sport more strategic, more entertaining, even safer in the long run. But they also left scars and bodies, on legacies, on the reputation of the league itself. As we go deeper, we will uncover stories few fans know. The infamous 1946 hidden ball trick that sparked outrage. The brutal head slap move perfected by Deacon Jones, outlawed because it left opponents concussed. The silent bargains between coaches and referees, where uncalled penalties became part of the strategy. The shadow economy of signals, spies, and technology that blurred the line between preparation and cheating. We will explore how illegal moves shaped rivalries, defined eras, and even altered championships. How the New England Patriots Spygate scandal changed the perception of dynasty. How the New Orleans Saints Bountygate scandal exposed a culture of violence that had long been whispered about. How every controversy forced the NFL to adapt, creating the game we recognize today. And we will ask the uncomfortable question: can you ever truly separate football from illegality? Because at its core, football is about pushing limits, the limits of the human body, the limits of strategy, the limits of what is allowed. And every time someone crosses the line, the NFL must decide whether to punish, to adapt, or to embrace. This documentary is not a celebration of cheating, nor is it a condemnation. It is an exploration of how rule breakers, whether intentional or not, shape the destiny of the sport. So as we begin, think about what the NFL would look like without its dark chapters, without the flying wedge, without the head slap, without Spygate, Bountygate, Deflategate. Would it be safer? Would it be fairer? Or would it be something less? Because history shows us this: football has always thrived on the edge. And those who dared to step over it, for better or worse, made the game what it is today. This is NFL's illegal moves. This is how rule breakers shaped the game. The story of football as earliest years is not one of polished plays or graceful spirals sailing through autumn skies. It is a story of chaos, of men crashing into one another with such force that their collisions rattled not just bones, but the very foundation of the sport itself. To understand the dark edge of football, the side that would eventually force rulemakers to act, we must go back to a time when the game was less about finesse and more about survival. It was the late 1800s, before the National Football League even existed. College football reigned supreme. Fields were muddy. Helmets were optional lore, non-existent and the game was brutal beyond comprehension. Amid this chaos emerged one of the most infamous formations in football history: the Flying Wedge. The wedge was not elegant, not sophisticated. It was raw strategy born out of the desire to dominate by sheer force. 11 men would lock arms, form a human wall, and charge downfield like a medieval battering ram. At the tip of the wedge stood the fastest runner, shielded by his teammates. Practically unstoppable as they plowed into defenders who had little chance of holding their ground. Spectators described it as both thrilling and horrifying. When the wedge moved, the earth seemed to quake. A roar would rise from the crowd, equal parts awe and fear. For defenders, there was no clear way to stop it. They threw their bodies into the wall of flesh and bone, often getting trampled beneath it. The carnage was extraordinary. By the 1890s, reports of deaths on the field were alarmingly common. In one season alone, newspapers recorded over a dozen fatalities directly tied to football. Concussions, broken necks, internal bleeding. Wedge was more than a play. It was a weapon. And yet, fans loved it. The brutality was part of the appeal. Football was violent, and that violence made it different from baseball or track or rowing. This was America's war game, and in its earliest chapters, the flying wedge was its deadliest maneuver. But the wedge also revealed something else: the desperate need for rules. Football at that time was closer to organized mayhem than structured sport. Coaches and players were innovators, pushing boundaries to see what could be gotten away with. The wedge was technically legal, but it blurred the line between strategy and assault. And in those blurred lines, the DNA of the modern NFL was already forming. Because at its core, football has always been about that tension. How far can players push the limits of safety, fairness, and legality before someone steps in to stop them? The wedge was the first great test of that question. Imagine a Saturday afternoon in 1892. 100 men gather on the sidelines in wool coats, cheering as two teams line up on a muddy field. The ball is snapped, and instantly the wedge forms. A wall of bodies surges forward, arms locked tight, heads down, steam rising in the cold air. The crowd erupts as defenders throw themselves into the charge. The sound is deafening, like train cars colliding. When the dust clears, half a dozen players are sprawled on the ground, motionless. Trainers rush out, not with high-tech gear or medical knowledge, but with smelling salts and buckets of water. Players stagger to their feet or are carried away. The game resumes. That image captures both the horror and allure of early football. It was not safe, but it was spectacle. And in that spectacle, the future of the sport was being shaped. The controversy surrounding the wedge grew so loud that it reached the highest levels of American society. By the early 1900s, President Theodore Roosevelt himself intervened. Alarmed by the mounting fatalities, he summoned college football leaders to the White House in 1905. His message was simple: reform the game, or risk losing it altogether. Out of those meetings came sweeping changes, the creation of what would eventually become the NCAA, and the banning of formations like the wedge. This was more than just a rule change. It was a moment of reckoning. For the first time, football's guardians acknowledged that the sport's survival depended on balancing danger with order. Rules had to evolve, not to stifle competition, but to preserve it. And so the wedge, once the pride of early innovators, became the first outlaw of football history. Yet even as it was banned, its legacy lived on. The wedge set the template for what would follow: a constant game of cat and mouse between players seeking an edge and rulemakers seeking to rein them in. That push and pull would echo for decades. Every illegal hit, every bend technique, every gray area innovation could trace its lineage back to the wedge. And here lies the dark irony. The wedge was outlawed, but its spirit never truly died. You can see echoes of it in modern kickoff returns in wedge-like blocking schemes, in the relentless search for formations that maximize power and minimize vulnerability. It is as if football cannot escape its own origin story. When we talk about the dark side of football, this is where it begins. Not with steroids, not with bounty scandals, not even with concussions. It begins with a wall of men charging downfield, defying common sense, daring someone to stop them. For the pioneers of the sport, it was not about legality. It was about survival, dominance, and pride. For the men crushed under its weight, it was about sacrifice, often at the cost of health or even life. And for the fans who watched from the stands, it was about witnessing something raw, dangerous, and undeniably American. As the NFL would later discover, those impulses do not vanish. They evolve. The flying wedge may be gone from the rulebook, but its shadow stretches long across the history of football. It tells us that from the very beginning, the game has been built on a paradox. It must be violent enough to thrill, but not so violent that it destroys itself. That paradox will guide every illegal move, every outlawed technique, every moment where innovation collides with regulation. This is the starting point of our journey into football's dark side. It begins with pioneers who are not afraid to risk everything. and with a game that nearly consumed itself before it could truly be born. And as we move forward, we'll see how the same question, the same tension between survival and destruction resurfaced again and again. The wedge was outlawed, but the mindset that created it, that would never disappear. They were not the stars on the posters. They were not the men whose jerseys filled the stands on Sundays. Yet without them, the very playbook of the NFL would look entirely different. These are the hidden innovators, players whose experiments, instincts, and sometimes accidents changed the way the game was played forever. Their stories are buried beneath highlight reels, their names overshadowed by louder legends. But football, in its current form, owes as much to them as it does to the icons we know. In the early decades, the NFL was rigid, almost mechanical. Coaches enforced strict adherence to schemes that had been carried over from college. Passing was rare. Plays were predictable. Power was valued more than creativity. But scattered across the league were athletes who refused to simply accept the boundaries of the rulebook. These men bent their bodies, their instincts, and sometimes the very definitions of legality in ways that redefined the possibilities of the game. One of the earliest examples came in the 1930s with Sammy Baugh of the Washington Redskins. While remembered today as one of the first great quarterbacks, what many forget is just how radical his use of the forward pass was. At the time, passing was considered risky, almost gimmicky. Coaches believed it was unreliable, suited only for desperate moments. But Baugh weaponized it. He did not just throw to escape pressure, he threw to attack. His spirals cut through defenses that had never been trained to defend deep routes. To traditionalists, it looked almost like cheating the natural order of the sport. To Baugh, it was the future. Yet, Baugh was not alone. Across the decades, innovations often began in hidden corners of the league. Players like Marion Motley, who in the 1940s bulldozed defenders as a fullback for the Cleveland Browns, quietly demonstrated that size and speed could coexist in one position. At the time, most backs were expected to either run or block. Motley did both with dominance, forcing defenses to adapt in ways that would eventually evolve into the modern linebacker role. He was not recognized as an innovator during his career. He was recognized simply as a problem. Only years later did historians realize that Motley had forced football into a new era. Then came Elroy Kreseleg's Hirsch, whose unusual running style, zigzagging, knees high, arms flailing, baffled defenders in the 1950s. Coaches initially tried to fix his form, thinking it inefficient. But Hirsch refused. His style was his advantage. His legs churned unpredictably, making him harder to tackle. He turned awkwardness into innovation. Today, football celebrates uniqueness in wide receivers, but Hirsch was one of the first to prove that unorthodox could mean unstoppable. The history of football is filled with these hidden disruptors. The invention of the slot receiver role, the first use of a two tight end formation, even the audacity of scrambling quarterbacks. Almost none of these ideas were conceived in boardrooms or drawn perfectly on chalkboards. They were born in moments of instinct, in a broken play, in a desperate improvisation, in a player daring to do what was considered wrong. Take Fran Tarkenton, for example. In the 1960s, quarterbacks were drilled to stay in the pocket. Anything else was viewed as cowardice or incompetence. Contin did the opposite. Kotze spun, ran backwards, and created chaos. Announcers mocked him. Coaches scolded him. Tezes cursed him. But slowly, the league realized that Tarkenton had uncovered a weapon no one else was using. He extended plays. He exhausted defenses. He showed that unpredictability could be as devastating as precision. Today's NFL, with quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, carries Tarkenton's fingerprints. What makes these hidden innovators so compelling is not just their creativity, but their resilience. Nearly all of them faced ridicule before recognition. Defensive linemen who dared to stand up instead of crouching. Wideouts who broke their routes early. safeties who crept closer to the line instead of playing deep. In their own eras, these moves were seen as sloppy, reckless, or even illegal. Over time, they became blueprints for entire playbooks. Consider the evolution of special teams. Long before the modern emphasis on return specialists, players like Gale Sayers transformed the act of fielding a punt into an art form. In an era when most return men simply tried to gain a few safe yards, Sayers danced through entire defenses. His vision, cuts, and balance looked almost like theater. Coaches began to rethink the punt return, not as a formality, but as a weapon. Today, the idea of scheming plays around return specialists feels natural. In Sayers' time, it felt revolutionary. There's also the story of innovators who were punished for their creativity. In the 1970s, Cliff Branch of the Raiders stretched defenses vertically in ways few receivers had before. His raw speed forced defensive backs to clutch, grab, and trip him, actions that at the time were tolerated. Branch did not just catch passes. He exposed the inadequacy of existing rules. Eventually, the league had to change. In 1978, the NFL outlawed defensive contact beyond 5 yards, a decision that many credit with ushering in the passing explosion of the modern game. Branch was never celebrated as a rule changer during his life. Yet his existence on the field forced a shift that defined the sport's future. Every generation of football has its hidden innovators. In the 1980s, Lawrence Taylor redefined the linebacker position, attacking quarterbacks from angles never before imagined. Coaches had to redesign offensive lines around him. In the 1990s, players like Randall Cunningham blurred the line between passer and rusher, hinting at the dual-threat revolution decades before it became mainstream. In the 2000s, a quiet wide receiver like Wes Welker showed that undersized players could dominate through precision in the slot, inspiring a generation of route runners who would carve out vital roles in every offense. The irony is that innovation is often invisible in real time. To fans, it looks like a fluke play, a lucky break, or a quirk of style. To coaches, it looks like disobedience. Only years later does history look back and say, that was the moment the game changed. And beneath every famous innovation, there are countless hidden ones that were lost to time. Plays that worked once, but were buried. Styles that clashed with coaches and were discarded. Players who tried something new, but never found the right stage. Football, as it exists today, is the product not only of the heroes we remember, but of the experiments we forget. These hidden innovators rarely saw themselves as pioneers. They were simply surviving, finding ways to outsmart, outmaneuver, or outlast opponents. They were bending the game because the game, in its rigid form, did not bend for them. And in doing so, they taught us that football has never been static. It is alive, evolving, mutating, pushed forward by men who dared to look reckless only to prove visionary. Their stories remind us that history is not just written by champions. It is written in the cracks of the game, in the decisions no one else thought to try, in the instincts that looked wrong until they became undeniable. The hidden innovators are football's unsung architects. Their fingerprints are everywhere, even if their names are not. And yet, their innovations did more than change strategy. They changed identity. They told players that creativity belonged on the field. That individuality mattered. That a sport obsessed with conformity could still be broken open by the imagination of a single athlete. That message, that courage to redefine boundaries, is why we watch. It is why football continues to feel new, even after a century of play. Because every leap forward in football, every sudden explosion of brilliance, begins the same way, with one player daring to be different. They say offense wins games, but defense wins championships. To understand that truth, you need to step back to the decades when the National Football League was still defining itself. This was not yet the high-scoring, highlight-driven league we know today. It was something grittier, something closer to a street fight dressed up in helmets and leather pads. And in that era, when rules were looser and violence was almost expected. A few men rose above the chaos not by catching touchdowns or calling audibles, but by reshaping the very idea of defense. They were not stars in the box scores. They were the architects of fear. The story of the defensive line begins with dirt under fingernails and blood on knuckles. In the 1930s and 1940s, linemen were often little more than human battering rams. Their job was simple: plug holes, absorb punishment, free up space for linebackers behind them. But in the shadows of stadium tunnels, in the quiet moments when coaches drew chalk lines across blackboards, a revolution was brewing. Men like Joe Capshaw, George Musso, and later Bill Willis started to see defense as more than brute force. They began to see it as geometry, as leverage, as a way to control not just the man in front of you, but the flow of an entire game. Bill Willis, a name often overlooked in the casual retelling of football history, was a pioneer in more ways than one. Playing for Paul Brown's Cleveland Browns in the 1940s, Willis lined up as a defensive guard, quick off the snap, low to the ground, cutting into backfields before offenses even had time to execute. He was one of the first to show that defense could be disruptive, that it was not just about reacting, but dictating. Willis, a black player breaking barriers in an era still poisoned by segregation, carried both the weight of history and the burden of invention. And every time he broke through a line, crashing into a quarterback or smothering a running play, he carved out a legacy that would echo through decades of football evolution. The defensive architects were not always celebrated. In fact, many of them were vilified. The league, eager to sell tickets and newspaper headlines, wanted stars who scored points, not men who choked them off. Defensive statistics were barely kept, tackles uncredited, pressures ignored. Yet it was these anonymous trench warriors who gave the NFL its toughness, its identity, its uncompromising edge. One of the most influential minds to ever grace a defensive sideline was Clark Shaughnessy. Though remembered primarily for his offensive innovations, he applied the same analytical mind to defense. Shaughnessy experimented with shifting linemen before the snap, disguising intentions and confusing quarterbacks in an age when most passers expected defenses to sit still. His theories were blueprint material, but it took players with the strength and courage to execute them. By the 1950s, the rise of men like Gino Marchetti transformed the role of defensive end. Marchetti, a war hero turned football player, brought battlefield intensity to the gridiron. He did not just play his position, he embodied it. Fast, aggressive, relentless, Marchetti gave birth to the idea of the pass rush as a weapon. He attacked quarterbacks with a fury that forced offenses to adjust to account for him on every single snap. Suddenly, defenses were not static. They were predators. This era also gave us Leo Nomellini, the 49ers Iron Man, who never missed a game in 14 seasons and played with the ferocity of a prizefighter. Nomellini understood that intimidation was as valuable as execution. He made offensive linemen flinch before the ball was even snapped. Together, Marchetti and Nomellini created a culture where defensive linemen were not placeholders but playmakers. Still, the defensive architects extended beyond the trenches. Linebackers began to emerge as field generals, orchestrating strategy in real time. Bill George of the Chicago Bears revolutionized the middle linebacker role in the 1950s. At first, he was supposed to line up on the line of scrimmage, but George had vision. He started stepping back, reading plays, roaming sideline to sideline. What he discovered became one of the most important positions in football history. From George would come Butkus Singletary, Ray Lewis, a lineage of defensive architects who not only stopped plays, but defined eras. The architects did not always work in silence. Some, like Deacon Jones, announced their presence with violence and charisma. Jones coined the term sack, and his signature head slap move left opponents dazed, concussed, humiliated. He turned defense into spectacle, forcing television cameras to linger on the destruction as much as the touchdowns. Jones knew that football was theater, and he made defense unforgettable. But beneath the highlight reels was something more enduring. These architects, whether linemen, linebackers, or ends, reshaped the rules of engagement. Their dominance forced the NFL to respond. Offensive holding penalties were enforced more tightly. Chop blocks and clotheslines were restricted. Protection for quarterbacks became more urgent. Every adjustment the league made was not just about safety, was about balancing a game increasingly tilted by defensive brilliance. By the late 1960s, the concept of the defensive architect reached its apex with the emergence of the Purple People Eaters in Minnesota, the Fearsome Foursome in Los Angeles, and later the Steel Curtain in Pittsburgh. These were not just defenses. They were cultural identities. They made entire fan bases proud, entire regions tough. And within each unit, individuals like Alan Page, Merlin Olsen, and Mean Joe Green etched themselves into the mythology of football. Alan Page was more than a player. He was an intellectual force, later becoming a Minnesota Supreme Court justice. On the field, he combined speed and intelligence, disrupting plays before they had a chance to develop. His presence demanded respect. His dominance forced evolution. Mean Joe Green, towering and intimidating, embodied Pittsburgh's working-class ethos. He was not just tackling opponents. He was symbolically tackling every insult, every doubt, every ounce of disrespect aimed at his city. These architects of defense changed not only the X's and O's, but the psychology of the sport. They made quarterbacks afraid to hold on to the ball. They made offensive linemen fear fatigue. They made coaches reimagine schemes and invent protections. They gave the NFL something it desperately needed: tension, balance, and a narrative of survival. Think about it. A touchdown without resistance is nothing more than a routine score. But a touchdown earned against the Purple People Eaters or the Steel Curtain, that was a triumph. That was storytelling. The architects understood, perhaps better than anyone, that greatness is only forged in opposition. They became the opposition, the crucible that shaped legends on both sides of the ball. As we trace the arc of NFL history, it becomes clear that the architects of defense left fingerprints on everything. The spread offenses of today, the quick passing games, the elaborate protections, they all exist because of the chaos and dominance these defenders once unleashed. They forced the game to evolve, not with speeches or votes, but with impact, pain, and persistence. In the end, the architects were more than players. They were engineers of fear, designers of disruption, builders of legacies. They worked in silence, often without credit, but their influence reverberates every Sunday in every stadium. Watch closely, and you can still see their blueprint in the trenches, in the blitzes, in the very structure of football itself. And so, as we close the chapter on the defensive architects, we open the door to the next story in this long, shadowed journey of the NFL. Because defense was only one layer of the dark side. In the next batch, we turn to the men on offense, who redefined the playbook, not with legal innovation, but with moves the league would later ban, outlaw, or erase from memory. The story of football has always been told in the trenches, in the collisions, in the battles for inches. But somewhere along the line, the game began to breathe differently. It began to widen, to stretch, to pull defenders away from their comfort zones. That shift did not come from quarterbacks alone. It came from the players who carried the ball, who blurred the line between brute force and ballet, who lined up in strange positions, daring coaches to rethink what was possible. They were the running backs and the tight ends, the strategic playmakers who turned the NFL into a game of imagination. Close your eyes and imagine the field in the 1940s. The game was narrower, literally and figuratively. The ball was snapped, the backs pounded forward, and defenses knew exactly where the danger was coming from. It was a grind, a war of attrition. Then came men who were not content to follow that script. Running backs with vision that stretched beyond the line of scrimmage, tight ends who refused to remain tethered to blocking duties, backs who could cut one way and throw the defense into chaos. They did not just play their positions, they changed them. In the early decades, the running back was already a celebrated figure. Red Grange, the galloping ghost, had electrified crowds in the 1920s with his open field runs. But what came later was different. These players didn't just run. They made defenses guess, hesitate, adjust. They turned football into a chess match. Take Paul Hornung of the Green Bay Packers in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Officially, he was a halfback. In reality, he was a Swiss Army knife. He ran, he caught, he passed, he kicked. He could line up anywhere and do anything. Under Vince Lombardi, Hornung became the embodiment of versatility. His very presence on the field forced defenses into uncertainty. Was he a runner, a passer, a receiver? The answer was all of the above. And that uncertainty was a weapon. Then came Gale Sayers, the Kansas Comet. If Hornung was a utility blade, Sayers was lightning bottled in human form. He did not just run around defenders, he erased their angles. In the 1960s, his speed and fluidity redefined what a running back could be. He was not simply another cog in a system. He was a system unto himself. Coaches and coordinators built entire game plans around his ability to slice through defenses. Every cut, every burst was not just athleticism, but strategy. Defenders had to spread wider, safeties had to creep up, and in doing so, they left space elsewhere. Sayers stretched the geometry of the game, but running backs alone could not expand the canvas. Another position had to evolve: the tight end. For decades, the tight end was almost invisible. He was a blocker with an occasional role in catching short, safe passes. His job was to protect, not to attack. That was until players like Mike Ditka arrived. In the early 1960s, Ditka, playing for George Halas's Chicago Bears, became something new. A tight end who could bulldoze linebackers not just with blocks, but with catches downfield. He was 6'3", 225 pounds, big enough to hold his ground in the trenches, yet fast and agile enough to move like a receiver. Defenses had no answer. Linebackers were too slow, defensive backs too small. Ditka cracked open the role, and suddenly coaches everywhere saw possibilities. The tight end was no longer chained to the line of scrimmage. He was a weapon in space. That transformation continued with players like John Mackey of the Baltimore Colts. Mackey was a freight train once he caught the ball. Watching him barrel down the sideline, dragging defenders, was a glimpse into the future. He forced the league to admit that a tight end could be as dangerous as any wide receiver. By the time Mackey was leading Colts offenses, defensive coordinators were tearing pages from old playbooks and starting over. What running backs and tight ends accomplished was not simply athletic brilliance, it was strategic innovation. They changed the questions coaches asked. For decades, the game had been predictable. Run here, pass there, block always. But these players blurred the categories. Suddenly, a halfback might throw. A fullback might catch. A tight end might stretch the seam for 20 yards. Every snap carried uncertainty, and that uncertainty was the seed of modern football. Consider O.J. Simpson in the 1970s, for all the controversy that would later surround his life. On the field, he was a revolution. Simpson was the first back to rush for more than 2,000 yards in a single season, 1973. In just 14 games, his dominance forced defenses to reimagine how to stop a ground attack. But more than raw numbers, it was how Simpson ran. His vision, his balance, his ability to read space transformed running into a strategic act. He was not just battering through. He was dissecting defenses with every stride. And then came the 1980s, when the idea of the all-purpose back reached new heights. Marcus Allen with the Raiders, Roger Craig with the 49ers. These were men who could run inside, catch outside, and even line up in the slot. Craig in particular embodied the evolution. In 1985, he became the first player in NFL history to record 1,000 rushing yards, and 1,000 receiving yards in the same season. He did not just play running back. He was a backfield receiver, a route runner, a multi-dimensional threat. He expanded the playbook simply by existing. Meanwhile, the tight end position was exploding into something entirely new. Kellen Winslow of the San Diego Chargers turned it into an art form. In Don Coryell's pass-happy offense, Winslow became the centerpiece, not the accessory. He lined up wide, in the slot, in motion. He caught passes like a wideout, but punished tacklers like a lineman. Defenses simply had no formula for him. The game he played in January 1982 against the Miami Dolphins, remembered as the epic in Miami, showed the world what a tight end could be. Exhausted, dehydrated, injured, Winslow caught 13 passes for 166 yards and a touchdown, blocking a field goal in the process. He collapsed after the game, carried off by teammates, but by then he had made his point. The tight end was no longer a silent partner. He was the star. By the time the 1990s and 2000s arrived, the legacy of these strategic playmakers was everywhere. Marshall Faulk turned the Rams into the greatest show on turf, lining up all over the field, forcing defenses into impossible choices. Shannon Sharpe redefined the tight end once more, combining wide receiver finesse with linebacker toughness. LaDainian Tomlinson broke records in the 2000s, scoring touchdowns in every possible way. Tony Gonzalez brought the tight end into the modern era, showing longevity and dominance through 2 decades. And so the game that began as a series of straight-line runs and predictable blocks had transformed into something dynamic, flexible, unpredictable. The men who made that possible were not always quarterbacks or headline stars. They were running backs with vision, tight ends with courage, and coaches willing to unleash them. They proved that strategy was not written in ink, but in motion, in the cuts and collisions on the field. Today, when we watch Travis Kelce dominate as a receiving threat, or Christian McCaffrey move seamlessly between rushing and receiving, we are witnessing the descendants of that lineage. Every yard gained in the open field, every tight end streaking down the seam, carries with it echoes of those who came before. They were the strategic playmakers, and they left the game forever changed. This was not about brute strength alone. It was about intelligence, adaptability, vision. It was about seeing the field differently, forcing everyone else to see it differently too. And in that way, they reshaped football itself. Their story is not just about highlights or statistics. It is about the courage to play outside the lines, the creativity to reinvent roles, and the will to bend a rigid game into something beautiful. The NFL as we know it could not exist without them. The field widened because they demanded it. The playbook expanded because they insisted on more. And the game we watch today, faster, smarter, more complex, is their legacy. They were the runners who could not be caught, the blockers who refused to stay silent, the playmakers who forced the game into its future. And this is only the beginning of their story. The history of the NFL is often told through its brightest stars. The quarterbacks whose names echo in stadiums, the running backs who broke records, the receivers whose highlight reels became timeless. But beneath those shining lights lies a foundation few recognize. Men who never asked for the spotlight, who never became legends in headlines, yet whose influence shaped the game in ways statistics can never capture. This is the story of the overlooked mentors. The NFL's early decades were a time of chaos when the rules were unsettled and the money was thin. Many players juggled football with day jobs, coaching roles, or even military service. In this fragile ecosystem, mentorship was not an abstract concept. It was survival. Veterans would take rookies under their wing, not for glory, but because if the team failed, everyone failed. Some men understood that their real value was not in the yards they gained or the tackles they made, but in the knowledge they passed on. One of those figures was Clyde "Bulldog" Turner. Known as one of the greatest centers of the 1940s Chicago Bears dynasty, Turner was more than just a player on the field. He became the quiet architect of a culture. When George Halas demanded toughness, Turner showed rookies how to endure it. When younger linemen faltered under the weight of Halas's demanding practices, Turner pulled them aside, gave them the tricks he had learned, showed them how to read defenses, how to conserve energy, how to hold up against men twice their size. He was the bridge between coaching theory and playing reality. And though history remembers Halas, the players remember Turner as the one who made the lessons livable. Stories like Turner's multiplied across the league. Take Lou Groza of the Cleveland Browns. All fans knew him for his accurate kicking and sturdy offensive line play. Teammates saw something else. Groza was a man who carried himself like a teacher. He instructed linemen on footwork, gave pointers on hand placement, explained the nuances of leverage. Younger Browns would later recall how Groza's words stayed with them long after they left Cleveland. His mentorship kept the Browns line one of the most disciplined in the game for over a decade. The NFL's overlooked mentors were not always stars. Some were journeymen who traveled from team to team carrying lessons like craftsmen with worn tools. Their careers often lacked stability, but their presence in locker rooms created continuity where chaos might have reigned. These men taught discipline to rookies fresh out of college, showed them how to balance life on the road, how to take care of bodies battered by Sunday collisions. Some even sacrificed their own playing time, stepping aside for younger athletes but staying on as guides. Consider the tight ends of the 1960s, a position still in evolution. While names like Mike Ditka defined the position's visibility, many unsung players quietly refined its craft behind the scenes. They were not stars, but they showed teammates how to block, how to create mismatches, how to understand angles. Their influence allowed others to shine. Without those lessons, the evolution of the tight end might have stalled, and the offensive revolution of the modern NFL could have taken decades longer. Mentorship also existed in darker corners of the league, away from glory. In the trenches, defensive linemen learned brutal hand-fighting techniques from veterans who never saw Pro Bowls. Some of these methods were borderline illegal, others perfectly legal, but subtle enough to escape referees' eyes. These tricks, passed down quietly, allowed younger players to compete at higher levels and extended the careers of entire defensive units. Behind every dominant line was usually one quiet veteran. Quote, his role was less about sacks and more about schooling the next generation. Perhaps the most poignant stories of overlooked mentors came in the era of integration. The NFL, like much of America, wrestled with issues of race. Black players entering predominantly white teams faced isolation, hostility, and sometimes outright violence. It was often older black veterans who guided them through. Players like Bill Willis of the Cleveland Browns carried not only the responsibility of playing at the highest level, but also of teaching younger black athletes how to endure racism while still excelling. Willis's courage in the face of constant hostility became a lifeline for others who followed. His mentorship extended beyond football. It was survival, dignity, resilience. There were also white players who acted as quiet allies. Some stood beside their black teammates in segregated hotels, refusing to eat in restaurants that turned others away. These gestures rarely made headlines, but they built bonds that shaped team chemistry and carried through seasons. In their own way, they were mentors in humanity, teaching others that the game was about more than points and yards. The 1970s brought a different kind of overlooked mentor. The game was getting faster, television was magnifying stars, and fame was beginning to reshape the league. Yet, even as highlight reels celebrated quarterbacks and wide receivers, there were older linebackers and safeties who became guides. These men would spend hours in film rooms, breaking down plays not just for themselves, but for rookies too overwhelmed to process the complexity. Coaches relied on them as secondary teachers, extensions of the playbook in the locker room. The game evolved, but the quiet influence of overlooked mentors never faded. Think of players like Jim Otto, the Oakland Raiders' legendary center. Otto was known for toughness, for playing through countless injuries, but teammates remembered him for his willingness to teach. Young linemen who joined the Raiders recalled Otto's constant presence, explaining schemes, correcting mistakes, keeping spirits steady through Al Davis's demanding culture. Otto's body may have paid the price, but his influence built generations of linemen who carried forward the Raider mystique. Mentorship in the NFL was often invisible by design. It required humility. These men knew their names might never be etched into history books, but they understood the greater truth that football is not just about the men who score touchdowns, but about the chain of knowledge passed from one era to the next. Without that chain, dynasties collapse, schemes fail, and traditions wither. The overlooked mentors also remind us that football is a human game. For every record-breaking quarterback, there was often a veteran backup teaching him how to read defenses from the sidelines. For every receiver who dominated highlight reels, there was a mentor in the locker room teaching him how to run routes with precision. For every defense that terrorized offenses, there was usually a player no one remembers today who had quietly taught his unit the finer points of alignment and communication. They may not be immortalized in statues or enshrined in Canton, but they remain in the DNA of the game. Every time a rookie steps onto an NFL field with a calm presence, every time a young lineman executes perfect technique, every time a team overcomes adversity together, is the legacy of mentors who gave without expecting recognition. The story of overlooked mentors is not one of glory, but of sacrifice. These men believed that the team mattered more than the self, that the future mattered more than the present. They accepted obscurity so that others could shine. And in doing so, they built the scaffolding of the NFL as we know it. Because in football, greatness is not only measured by yards gained or touchdowns scored. Sometimes it is measured in whispers in the locker room, in advice given at just the right moment, in the lessons that carry a young player through the chaos of a brutal sport. Sometimes greatness is invisible, and yet it is those invisible forces that shape everything. These overlooked mentors may never dominate highlight reels or headlines, but their fingerprints are on every era of the NFL. They shaped not only the game, but the men who played it. And in that quiet, uncelebrated work, they left a mark deeper than any trophy or record could capture. They were the teachers, the guides, the guardians of football's soul. And without them, the NFL would not be what it is today. In the NFL, the quarterback is usually the face of the franchise. The name on the marquee, the player children imitate in backyards and playgrounds. From Johnny Unitas to Tom Brady, the position has long been synonymous with glory, leadership, and fame. But hidden beneath the surface of this mythology are the quarterbacks, whose names are rarely uttered outside of old locker rooms and family living rooms. They were the men who led without headlines, who carried teams without statues, who endured hits, injuries, and doubts, yet never claimed the limelight. They were the unsung quarterbacks, and their stories reveal a quieter, often more poignant side of the NFL's history. Imagine the scene in the early 1970s. A muddy field, wind slicing across the bleachers, the crowd restless as another drive stalls. The scoreboard shows little hope, and yet, under center, a quarterback crouches low, barking signals, his voice barely audible above the roar. He knows this might not end with a highlight on national television. He knows fans may not even remember his name. Still, he snaps the ball, threads a pass into a tight window, and absorbs a crushing hit that leaves him struggling for breath. Plays like these rarely made the highlight reels, but without them, franchises never survive. Seasons never progress, and teammates never believe. These were the men who often carried the weight of entire locker rooms, balancing the egos of star receivers, calming huddles when the offensive line broke down, and delivering steady leadership when chaos threatened to consume the game. They were not the superstars with endorsement deals or magazine covers. They were the quarterbacks who quietly did their job, game after game, sometimes year after year, and walked away with little more than the respect of their teammates. Take Don Strock, for instance. To the casual fan, his name might not carry the gravitas of a Marino or a Montana. But inside NFL circles, Strock was the definition of a professional quarterback. Drafted by the Miami Dolphins in 1973, he spent most of his career as a backup. Yet when called upon, he delivered moments that became part of NFL lore. His most famous came in the 1982 AFC Divisional Playoff against the San Diego Chargers, a game still remembered as the epic in Miami. With Miami down 24-0, Strock entered the game and ignited one of the greatest comebacks in postseason history, throwing for 403 yards and 4 touchdowns. Though the Dolphins eventually fell short in overtime, Strock's performance became legendary among those who knew football's inner heartbeat. And yet, outside of that one game, history barely remembers him. A career spent mostly on the sidelines, preparing, mentoring, and stepping in only when needed, left Strock as a quiet figure in NFL history. But to his teammates, he was a leader. The story of Steve DeBerg offers another window into the unsung role. DeBerg played 17 seasons in the NFL, often as the bridge between one franchise quarterback and the next. He was the quarterback teams turned to when they needed stability, professionalism, and someone to steady the ship. Though he never reached a Super Bowl, his impact stretched far beyond wins and losses. DeBerg was known as a mentor, a man who guided younger quarterbacks like Joe Montana, John Elway, and Steve Young, players who would go on to become icons. In many ways, DeBerg embodied the paradox of the unsung quarterback, overshadowed by legends yet essential to their growth. Without him, the NFL landscape of the 1980s and 1990s might look very different. Consider also Jeff Hostetler, forever in the shadow of Phil Simms with the New York Giants. When Simms went down with an injury late in the 1990 season, Hostetler stepped in. Not with fanfare, but with quiet determination. The Giants entered the playoffs as underdogs, but Hostetler's steady play carried them all the way to Super Bowl 25 against the Buffalo Bills. He delivered a poised performance, surviving relentless pressure and guiding the Giants to a stunning 22-19 victory, capped by Scott Norwood's infamous missed field goal. Hostetler's reward was fleeting. Though he would start for the Raiders and Washington later in his career, his name never ascended into the pantheon of great quarterbacks. Yet, for that one magical stretch, he was everything a leader should be: calm, resilient, unshaken by the enormity of the moment. The unsung quarterback often existed in eras where passing was dangerous, where offensive lines were porous, and where the punishment was unrelenting. In the 1950s and 1960s, quarterbacks like Milt Plum of the Cleveland Browns and Detroit Lions delivered years of service without headlines. Plum once held the single-season passer rating record for decades, yet his name is scarcely remembered today. In the 1970s, Jim Hart led the St. Louis Cardinals through years of mediocrity, throwing for over 34,000 yards in his career, more than legends like Troy Aikman or Bart Starr. Still, his legacy remains buried, overshadowed by championship winners. The common thread among all these men is sacrifice. They played not for glory, but for the chance to compete, to lead, to be part of something larger than themselves. Many endured constant criticism, often blamed for failures that were the result of weak rosters or failing organizations. They were booed at home games, dismissed by sports writers, and overlooked by fans chasing the bigger names. And yet, in locker rooms, their voices carried weight. Offensive linemen trusted them. Coaches leaned on them. Wide receivers respected their grit. They were leaders, even when history chose not to record their names in bold print. The irony is that, in many ways, the unsung quarterbacks preserved the very mythology of the position. Their quiet resilience allowed franchises to survive long enough to draft stars. Their professionalism set standards for preparation and leadership. Their ability to absorb punishment without complaint gave teammates something to rally around. They were the glue that held teams together in the years between dynasties and the moments between glory. As we reflect on the history of the NFL, the spotlight inevitably falls on the Mannings, the Montanas, the Bradys. But in the shadows of those legends were quarterbacks who carried the same burdens with fewer rewards. They faced the same blitzes, the same broken ribs, the same sleepless nights studying film. They too inspired teammates, rallied crowds, and gave fans fleeting moments of hope. Their legacy is quieter, less celebrated, but no less vital. When we think about what it means to play quarterback, perhaps the truest definition lies not in the Super Bowl MVP trophies or the Hall of Fame busts. Perhaps it lies in the grit of a Don Strock, the steadiness of a Steve DeBerg, the resilience of a Jeff Hostetler, or the loyalty of a Jim Hart. They remind us that leadership is not always about the roar of the crowd. Sometimes it is about standing tall when no one is watching, delivering when no one expects it, and sacrificing personal glory for the sake of the team. The story of the NFL is incomplete without them, and though history may never elevate them to the level of legends, the men who played alongside them will never forget. For in the huddles, in the trenches, and in the quiet moments of resolve, these unsung quarterbacks carried the game on their shoulders, just as surely as any superstar ever did. They were leaders in the shadows. And sometimes, those shadows reveal the truest light. They were the men who never got their names in lights, who never heard the roar of the crowd chanting just for them, who never made the highlight reels that re-air every Sunday morning before kickoff. Yet without them, entire franchises would have collapsed. Quarterbacks would have been broken, and dynasties would have never been built. These were the forgotten workhorses of professional football. The running backs who carried the ball carried the weight, and carried the game forward without ever receiving the glory. The early NFL was brutal. Offensive lines were patchwork, passing was rare, and the entire strategy revolved around grinding the ball up the middle. That meant the running backs were battered again and again, play after play, season after season. The stars of today get measured by touchdowns, explosive plays, and jersey sales. The backs of yesterday, they were measured by how much punishment they could take, how many times they could stagger to their feet after being crushed by a pile of humanity and still line up for the next snap. They were anonymous gladiators in mud-stained uniforms, putting their bodies on the line so that others could shine. When we talk about workhorses, we are not talking about finesse. We are talking about durability, about grit, about the quiet kind of courage that goes unrecognized. These backs ran the ball 20, 30, even 40 times in a single game. They were not juking defenders in open space. They were running headfirst into defenses that knew exactly what was coming. The opponents were stacked in the box, ready to hit them, and yet they kept going, yard after yard, hit after hit. These backs defined toughness in an era where pain was not avoided, but expected. Men like John Henry Johnson embodied this role. He was not a flashy name compared to some of his contemporaries, but he ran with such violence and determination that defenders dreaded facing him. Johnson's carries were less about highlight runs and more about breaking the will of a defense, one collision at a time. The yards added up, the hits piled on, and at the end of the game, it was his quiet, relentless grind that allowed his team to win. But in the headlines the next day, it was often the quarterback or a wide receiver who stole the ink. Johnson's role, like so many backs of his time, was essential, but it was invisible to all but the men who played beside him. Then there were men like Larry Brown of Washington, a back who ran behind lines that were often average against defenses stacked to stop him. He endured punishment that would cripple most players. He was the workhorse of his team, the engine that kept their offense alive. And yet, outside of brief flashes of recognition, his legacy is too often forgotten. His career became a study in sacrifice. Short bursts of brilliance, followed by the slow, inevitable breakdown of a body asked to do too much. His story is not unique. It is the shared story of countless running backs whose names have been buried by time. The forgotten workhorses did not just carry the ball, they carried their teammates. Coaches leaned on them when the passing game faltered. Quarterbacks trusted them to take the hits that would have otherwise been their own. Offensive linemen knew that no matter how many defenders stacked the line, their backs would run behind them, fearless and uncomplaining. These players kept games alive when all else failed. What makes their stories haunting is how little recognition they received in their own time. Modern fans know the names of Barry Sanders, Walter Payton, or Emmitt Smith. But what about Marion Motley, who ran with a ferocity that helped break racial barriers, while also redefining what a running back could be? What about backs who spent entire seasons grinding out 3 yards per carry, never breaking a long touchdown run, but keeping their team's drive alive again and again? These men were not just players, they were foundations. And foundations, by their nature, are meant to be hidden, holding up everything else while going unnoticed. The brutality of their workload was staggering. In the modern NFL, teams rotate backs. They manage touches. They count reps to preserve careers. But in the old game, the workhorse had no such luxury. If you were the running back, you carried the ball until your legs gave out. Injuries were played through. Pain was ignored, and the only measure of success was whether you could answer the call on the next snap. The cost of this system was clear: short careers, broken bodies, and futures filled with pain. But in the moment, no one cared. Fans cheered the touchdowns. Coaches demanded more carries. Owners cashed in the ticket sales, and backs kept running. The culture of football at the time praised toughness above all. To complain was to risk your job. To show weakness was to be replaced. So the forgotten workhorses stayed silent. They iced their bruises, taped up their ankles, and told trainers they were fine. They sacrificed tomorrow for today, careers for games, health for yards. It was not glamorous. It was not celebrated. But it was football. Some of these backs had moments of glory-brief flashes when the cameras caught them breaking free for a long run or scoring a decisive touchdown. But those moments were islands in oceans of thankless labor. What defined them was not the highlight, but the grind. And in that grind, they revealed a kind of greatness that is easy to overlook, but impossible to deny. Their legacies endure not in record books, but in the memories of teammates who knew what they endured. Quarterbacks remembered who saved them from being crushed by a blitz. Offensive linemen remembered who kept fighting even when the hole wasn't there. Coaches remembered the player who would carry the team on his back, literally and figuratively, when nothing else worked. These men built reputations inside locker rooms that never translated into fame outside them. And yet, even in their anonymity, they shaped the game. They taught the league what durability meant. They proved that winning required more than stars and spectacular plays, required men willing to take the hard yards, the painful yards, the unglamorous yards. They made football a sport of attrition, of willpower, of endurance. Without them, the game would never have grown into what it became. The tragedy is that so many of them faded from public memory. Their names are footnotes, their careers reduced to statistics buried in dusty archives. But when you peel back the surface of the NFL's history, when you look past the headlines and the highlight reels, you find them everywhere. The forgotten workhorses breaking their bodies so that others could build legacies. They carried the load without ever receiving the glory. And so, as we look back on the evolution of professional football, we cannot tell the story without them. They were not the stars, not the icons, not the faces on posters. They were something harder, something grittier, something more human. They were the ones who got up when they should have stayed down, who kept running when logic said to quit, who turned punishment into progress. They were the backbone of the league. This is their story, not of fame, but of endurance. Not of glory, but of sacrifice. Not of highlight reels, but of hard yards. They were the forgotten workhorses, and they carried football itself on their backs. They were the last line of defense. the players who lived in the shadows of the spotlight. Quarterbacks had their glory. Running backs had their touchdowns. Wide receivers had their highlight reels. But behind it all, in the quiet corners of the field, were men who shaped the game in silence. Safeties and cornerbacks, often forgotten in the stat sheets, but always remembered by the quarterbacks who feared throwing their way. This is their story, the tale of the guardians who changed football, but whose names rarely echoed beyond the stadium walls. In the earliest days of professional football, the passing game was a novelty. Teams ran the ball into piles of bodies, grinding out yards the hard way. Cornerbacks and safeties were more afterthoughts than stars. Yet even then, a handful of them were already redefining what it meant to play defense. They weren't just tackling machines. They were readers of minds, interpreters of formations, prophets of plays yet to unfold. With every snap, they studied eyes, shoulders, hips in a clue that told them where the ball might go. The position demanded invisibility. A great cornerback wasn't always the one intercepting passes. Sometimes it was the man who erased the other team's biggest weapon so thoroughly that he disappeared from the game plan. You didn't see their brilliance on the highlight reels because a pass never thrown was a victory never noticed. Safeties, too, were anonymous guardians. They patrolled deep space, watching everything, waiting for their moment to strike. They were the ones who punished receivers who dared to stretch the field, who closed gaps between dreams and disaster in seconds. They sacrificed their bodies, absorbing hits that echoed like thunder, and when the crowd roared, it wasn't always for them. But without them, football would have been chaos. By the 1940s and 50s, as passing began to grow in importance, the value of these shadow defenders became undeniable. Men like Emlyn Tunnell changed the way fans thought about defensive backs. Tunnell was not only the first African American to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He was a player who turned interceptions into an art. With 79 career picks, he wasn't just a safety. He was a thief in the night, robbing quarterbacks of their ambitions and giving his team the kind of momentum that shifted championships. Yet even with such brilliance, his name faded behind the glow of offensive legends. For cornerbacks, their greatness was often invisible. Their job was to prevent the spectacular, not to create it. But in the process, they forced offenses to evolve. Quarterbacks learned to look away from elite corners to settle for shorter, safer passes. Entire playbooks were rewritten because of a single man lined up wide. It was a battle of wills, one fought not under the lights of fame, but in the silence of erased opportunities. As the decades rolled on, safeties grew into enforcers. In the 1970s, the steel curtain defense of Pittsburgh relied on men like Donnie Shell, who made receivers regret stepping into his territory. They weren't glamorous players, but they embodied fear. Every quarterback knew that sending a receiver over the middle meant gambling with his well-being. That gamble shaped the modern passing game, forcing offenses to adapt to the lurking threat of a crushing hit. Yet for every safety who earned some recognition, there were dozens more who slipped into history's shadows. Corners, especially, were ghosts. They played on islands, isolated against the game's fastest athletes. One misstep, and the world saw their failure. But when they succeeded, the camera never followed them. The ball never came their way. Their brilliance lived in absence, in plays that never happened. Think of the anonymous cornerbacks who defined eras without fanfare. Men who shut down elite receivers game after game, but left the field without applause because greatness, in their case, meant nothingness. How do you measure the impact of a pass that wasn't thrown? How do you celebrate the silence of a quarterback's hesitation? Their legacy lived in empty stat lines of their opponents, not in gaudy numbers of their own. Safeties, meanwhile, carried dual responsibilities. They were both defenders and leaders, reading offenses and directing teammates, calling out adjustments, ensuring order in the chaos. Many were quarterbacks of the defense, their voices unheard on broadcasts, but vital on the field. They were the men who made sure everyone else was in position, who saved plays before they even began. Without them, defenses collapsed. With them, they thrived. In the 1980s and 90s, as the passing game exploded, these players became even more critical. Think of Ronnie Lott, whose ferocity changed the culture of defensive football. He was a star, yes, but his stardom was the exception, not the rule. For every Lott, there were dozens of safeties who played just as hard, just as smart, but whose names faded into obscurity. They sacrificed health, longevity, even memory for the sake of keeping their team alive, but history rarely remembered their sacrifice. The anonymity of these positions was cruel. Linemen had statistics for sacks and tackles. Quarterbacks had touchdowns. Receivers had yards. But what about the corner who forced an offense to abandon half the field? What about the safety who intimidated a quarterback into checking down instead of going deep? These weren't numbers that made headlines. They were invisible triumphs, real victories that lived only in the film rooms and the minds of coaches who knew. And yet, even in their anonymity, they shaped the game in profound ways. Rule changes were often the direct result of their brutality. Safeties who delivered bone-shattering hits forced the league to redefine what was legal. Corners who grabbed and held receivers forced new emphasis on pass interference. Their impact was so great that the NFL had to rewrite its laws to contain them. The irony was that even in shaping the rules, they stayed in the shadows. Fans remembered the spectacular receivers who benefited from loosened restrictions. They remembered the quarterbacks who threw 4 gaudy yards in the new era of passing. But rarely did they remember the defensive backs whose dominance forced those changes in the first place. Today, with advanced analytics and highlight-driven culture, we see more appreciation for defensive backs. Interceptions, pass breakups, coverage ratings, these are now measured, dissected, celebrated. Yet the DNA of the game still belongs to those forgotten guardians. Without their decades of anonymous brilliance, without their unseen sacrifices, offenses would never have evolved into the spectacle we watch now. Their story is not about fame. 'Tis about resilience, discipline, and silence. They were the defensive shadows, the men who built the foundation of modern football while living outside the camera's gaze. Their names may not be chanted, their jerseys may not be worn by millions, but the game they left behind carries their fingerprints in every defensive scheme, every deep safety alignment, every corner playing press coverage at the line. When the crowd cheers a spectacular catch, it is worth remembering the countless times such a play never happened at all, because somewhere in the shadows, a corner or safety did their job too well to be noticed. That is their legacy, the paradox of brilliance erased by its own success. And so we honor them, now the guardians of silence, the watchers in the deep, the men who shaped the game by disappearing within it. They may have lived in the shadows, but the history of football shines brighter because of them. They are the faceless guardians of football. The ones who rarely see their names in lights, the ones who almost never appear on highlight reels, and the ones who spend entire careers in anonymity, while being absolutely essential to every single victory. They are the offensive linemen, and for decades, they've been the silent architects of NFL dynasties, the men in the shadows who decide whether quarterbacks become legends or forgotten names. The NFL has always sold spectacle, the soaring passes, the dazzling runs, the impossible catches. Yet for every touchdown that echoes through history, there are 5 men on the line who made it possible. They stand shoulder to shoulder, helmets down, hands ready, weight balanced, waiting for the snap. The game begins with them. The collisions begin with them. The battle for control begins with them. To watch an offensive line at work is to watch controlled violence with an undertone of grace. In the instant the ball is snapped, every one of them knows exactly what must happen. Guard pulls across the line. A tackle seals the edge. A center shifts his hips to pick up the blitz. It happens in less than a second. It is not art for spectators. 'Tis art for insiders, for coaches who study tape and for players who live in the trenches. The crowd may not see it, but every touchdown is an offensive line masterpiece. Go back through history and you will see it. The Green Bay Packers of the 1960s, Lombardi's champions, remembered for Bart Starr and the Ice Bowl. But ask Starr himself, and he would tell you. It was Jerry Kramer and that iconic block in the cold that opened the path to glory. The dynasty was not written in the air. It was written in the ground game, forged by the line. The Dallas Cowboys of the 1990s, Troy Aikman, Michael Irvin, and Emmitt Smith became household names. They were the stars. But what was the foundation? The offensive line known simply as the Great Wall of Dallas. Nate Newton, Larry Allen, Mark Stipnoski, and others formed a fortress. They didn't just protect, they dominated. Emmitt Smith, the NFL's all-time leading rusher, would later say he could see holes open so wide he barely had to cut. Dynasties are not built on flash alone. They are built on walls. And yet, the tragedy is that most fans cannot name these men. They cannot recall their numbers, their stories, their sacrifices. Ask a casual fan about quarterbacks, and they will list dozens. Ask them about running backs, and they'll talk for hours. But offensive linemen, silence. Because in the NFL's culture, they were taught to be silent. Their job was to be invisible. The highest praise a lineman could hear. We never hear your name. Still, anonymity has never meant insignificance. In truth, the NFL rulebook itself bends and shapes around the offensive line. Holding calls, illegal hands to the face, ineligible receiver rules, chop block bans, all designed to govern the chaos of trench warfare. The line has always been a gray zone, a place where legality and illegality intertwine. Some of football's most notorious cheats and innovations were born here. The Raiders of the 1970s perfected the subtle hold, the little tug on a jersey just outside the referee's vision. Their line was infamous, drawing penalties, but also controlling games. Coaches knew a good offensive lineman could bend the rules just enough to give his quarterback time. It was not about breaking the rules, it was about dancing on the edge of them. Think of Joe Montana's 49ers. Yes, the West Coast offense redefined the passing game. But Bill Walsh knew his schemes lived or died with the men up front. Harris Barton, Jesse Sapolu, Bubba Paris, they weren't stars. But without their protection, the timing offense collapses. Dynasty is not just a word. It is repetition, drive after drive, season after season. Offensive linemen live that repetition until it becomes muscle memory, until it becomes instinct. Listen to retired quarterbacks, and they'll tell you the same truth. The bond between a quarterback and his lineman is sacred. They buy their linemen Rolexes, steak dinners, golf trips, because they know, no lineman, no career. Ask Andrew Luck, a star quarterback whose career ended early after years of hits behind struggling protection. Or David Carr, drafted first overall, sacked 76 times as a rookie, never recovering from the trauma. Offensive lines decide whether potential becomes legacy. The tragedy, again, is that they are remembered only in absence. When they fail, when the pocket collapses, when the quarterback is sacked. Only then do fans speak their names. Success means silence. Failure means infamy. It is a cruel paradox at the heart of football's greatest machine. And yet, if you listen closely, you will hear the echoes of their greatness. Alan Fanuca, Steve Hutchinson, John Hanna. Names that whisper among purists. Anthony Munoz, perhaps the greatest tackle ever. A lineman so dominant, he redefined what protection looked like. Larry Allen, a man of such strength that even legends told stories about him benching more than 700 pounds. Their legacy lives in tape rooms and in the quiet respect of peers. The NFL, for all its love of spectacle, cannot hide the truth. The offensive line is the most important unit on the field. They do not score points. They do not sell jerseys. But they win championships. Every dynasty, every legend, every immortalized quarterback owes his career to the wall in front of him. Watch closely, and you'll see it. In the trenches, 5 men move as one. They communicate without words. A glance, a shift in weight, a subtle nod. They pick up blitzes before the defense even shows them. They know the playbook better than anyone else, because they must know not just their assignment, but how it connects to every other man's. They are chess masters disguised as brawlers, technicians disguised as brutes. The game of football, for all its glamour, is still decided in those invisible battles. The NFL may celebrate the soaring touchdown, but coaches will always know. The game was won when the line held firm. And so, the story of the offensive lineman is not one of glory, but of sacrifice. Of choosing a role where recognition is rare, but impact is eternal. Of living in the shadows, yet shaping the very structure of the game. They are the unsung heroes, the builders of dynasties, the iron in the trenches. Because in the end, when history remembers quarterbacks and running backs and wide receivers, the truth lingers quietly. None of them could have stood tall without the silent giants who stood first. They never asked for applause. They never chased the spotlight. Their legacy is measured in yards gained, seasons saved, and dynasties built. The faceless few, the foundation of greatness. And though their names may fade from memory, the game itself, the game as we know it, was written by their hands. That is the paradox of the offensive line. Unseen, unheard, but unforgettable to those who understand. Football's greatest dynasties live in the trenches, carved by the men who built walls strong enough for legends to walk behind. The lights of the stadium are still bright, but the crowd's attention drifts elsewhere. The stars are on the sidelines. The quarterback is discussing plays with his coordinator. The wide receiver is sitting with his helmet off, cooling down. The defensive line is catching its breath. And yet, at the center of the field, in the middle of the overlooked chaos, a man stands alone, often unnoticed, preparing for a moment that can change everything. This is the life of a kicker, a punter, a returner of the hidden artisans of football who, with a single swing of the leg or a burst of speed through a narrow lane, decide destiny. For decades, the special teams unit was treated like a placeholder, an intermission in the performance of giants. They were backups, bench warmers, men who had no place on the offensive or defensive rosters, shuffled into a role that few respected. But history would prove otherwise. Across generations, names once whispered only by coaches and insiders began shaping outcomes that echoed forever. Think about it. The longest plays in NFL history do not come from quarterbacks or running backs. They come from kick returners streaking down the sidelines, punters flipping the field with a perfect spiral, and kickers hitting improbable distances when the game clock reads 0. These are the moments that shift balance. These are the moments remembered by millions. It begins in the 1960s, when special teams itself was hardly more than a loose concept. Before that, starters often doubled as return men or part-time kickers. The legends of the game, Paul Hornung, Lou Gross, were as comfortable putting the ball through uprights as they were taking handoffs or blocking downfield. But as the league expanded, specialization became necessary. Tom Landry's Dallas Cowboys were among the first to emphasize special teams as a dedicated unit, led by coaches who saw the hidden leverage of field position and momentum. That small recognition ignited a revolution. Take the punter, for instance. The casual fan rarely remembers a great punt, but coaches will tell you it can swing a championship. Ray Guy, drafted in the first round of 1973, became the archetype. Before him, punting was almost an afterthought, a duty anyone could fill. But Guy's booming spirals, soaring so high they seemed to touch the rafters, changed football's geometry. His kicks gave defenses more time to swarm. His leg forced opposing offenses into the shadow of their own end zone. It was strategy hidden inside silence, and it taught the league that punters mattered as much as any star. Then there were the kickers, men whose entire existence was compressed into a handful of seconds, often in moments too tense for words. Adam Vinatieri, standing in the snow of Foxborough, delivered a kick that defined a dynasty, sending the Patriots into history. His leg was steady when nerves should have cracked, when pressure should have crushed. Morten Andersen, George Blanda, Jan Stenerud. These were not afterthoughts. They were decision makers. One swing, one strike, entire seasons defined. But if punters controlled the chessboard and kickers ended games, it was the returners who electrified crowds, who turned silence into thunder with a single sprint. Gale Sayers in the 1960s was poetry in motion, slicing through coverage with an elegance unmatched. Later, Billy White Shoes Johnson danced down sidelines, changing the culture of celebration while flipping scores in seconds. In the 1990s and 2000s, Devin Hester redefined the role. His opening kickoff return in Super Bowl 41 is still etched in memory, a testament to how a returner could seize the grandest stage and turn it into his own. But the beauty of special teams was not just in highlight reels. It was in hidden battles fought every play. The gunners sprinting full speed downfield, sacrificing their bodies to stop a return man in his tracks. The long snappers executing one perfect motion after another with no room for error. The blockers who carved lanes in split-second choreography. This was football in its purest, most collective form, stripped of glory but vital to victory. Special teams also carried the game into innovation. Think of fake punts and trick plays when the most overlooked phase of football suddenly became the boldest. Sean Payton's surprise onside kick in Super Bowl 44 flipped momentum and delivered New Orleans a championship. Coaches who embraced special teams as a weapon rather than an afterthought etched themselves into history. And yet, for all the pivotal roles, special teams players lived with anonymity. Few jerseys bore their names. Few commercials featured their faces. Many were cut and replaced without notice, living in perpetual uncertainty. But those who endured became cult heroes to fans who understood. Steve Tasker, the Buffalo Bills' relentless gunner, earned Pro Bowl nods and universal respect without ever being a star in the traditional sense. His career symbolized what it meant to be invaluable in the shadows. There is also a deeper humanity in special teams. These were often the players clawing to stay in the league. A backup wide receiver who could return kicks survived a roster cut. A linebacker who excelled in coverage units found a second life. For them, every kickoff, every punt return was not just a play, was a lifeline. And perhaps that is why the effort felt different. Every yard was fought with desperation. Every tackle carried the weight of livelihood. Modern football has adjusted its rules, moving kickoffs forward, penalizing helmet-to-helmet hits, even experimenting with alternatives to reduce collisions. Some argue special teams is fading, but its spirit, its unpredictability, and its sheer drama remain. In every stadium, when the game tightens, when seconds remain, eyes still turn toward the man with the ball or the one with the leg. And in that moment, forgotten names again decide the fate of giants. From Ray Guy's towering punts to Adam Vinatieri's snow-splitting kicks. From Devin Hester's blazing runs to the hidden grit of gunners and blockers. Special teams has carved its legacy not in headlines, but in heartbeats. Football is not merely won by quarterbacks, running backs, or defensive stars. It is built piece by piece by men who never had the spotlight but changed the very outcomes of history. And so, as the story of the NFL unfolds, we cannot forget the innovators of special teams. The kickers who froze time, the punters who sculpted fields, the returners who defied possibility, and the quiet soldiers who filled the gaps between. Their contributions may have been hidden, their names less remembered, but without them, the game itself would be incomplete. This is the untold truth of football's most overlooked artists. This is the story of how special teams, doubted and underestimated, shaped legends in silence. In the theater of football, The roar of the crowd always rises for the touchdown, the sack, the interception, the dazzling sprint down the sideline. But beneath the spectacle, hidden in the chalk dust of playbooks and the quiet tension of sideline headsets, are men whose impact shaped the very way the game is played. They were not the players who caught the pass or made the tackle. They were the minds behind the curtain, the unsung strategists who saw the field differently, who built the modern game on their boards, and in their imaginations, who altered the geometry of football long before the rest of the league even caught up. When we talk about the greats, the spotlight often shines on the Lombardis and the Shulas, the towering figures who became symbols of entire eras. Yet hidden in their shadows were visionaries whose fingerprints are all over today's NFL. Coaches who worked as assistants, coordinators, or quiet innovators. Coaches who were never household names, but whose ideas redefined the sport. These were the architects of movement, the engineers of deception, the quiet teachers who transformed raw athleticism into organized chaos that left opponents bewildered. Football has always been a game of war, a contest of force and strategy. But in its earliest decades, plays were primitive, formations were predictable, and passing was seen as reckless. It took visionaries to expand the possibilities, to imagine not just 11 players crashing into 11, but space, timing, rhythm, and misdirection. These coaches transformed the gridiron into a chessboard, where every motion had a hidden purpose, every block a ripple effect, every decoy a weapon. Consider Clark Shaughnessy, a name most casual fans barely recognize. In the 1940s, Shaughnessy championed the T formation at a time when single-wing offenses dominated football. His vision was revolutionary. Put the quarterback under center, spread the backs, and unleash the passing game. To most, it seemed absurd, dangerous even. But Shaughnessy's T formation gave birth to the modern quarterback, to the dynamic interplay of run and pass. It was Shaughnessy who helped George Halas transform the Chicago Bears into a powerhouse, humbling Washington 73-0 in the 1940 NFL Championship. That was not just a victory, it was a manifesto. A new football had been born. Or take Sid Gilman, another name too often forgotten outside circles of football historians. Gilman believed that football was a game of space, that passing could stretch defenses not just horizontally, but vertically. He envisioned routes layered across the field, a symphony of movement designed to pry open vulnerabilities. Long before the West Coast offense, long before high-octane spread systems, Gilman was experimenting with vertical attacks that made defenses gasp for air. Every deep pass you see today, every seam route and flood concept carries his DNA. Then came the disciples, coaches, who absorbed those ideas and remixed them into new systems. Bill Walsh, of course, perfected the short passing orchestration of the West Coast offense. But behind him were assistant coaches, coordinators, thinkers who never became legends, but whose notebooks altered the playbooks of generations. Paul Brown deserves mention here too, not just as a coach, but as an innovator of structure. He pioneered the idea of using film study as a weapon, breaking down opponents with precision. He created the modern play-calling system, sending in plays with messenger guards before radios and tablets ever existed. And he built a disciplined, almost military organization that turned preparation into an art form. The truth is, many of these visionaries never stood on podiums with trophies. Some never even got the chance to be head coaches. They were assistants who shaped dynasties from the shadows. Take Tom Moore, the longtime offensive coordinator who never sought the limelight, but designed the framework that allowed Peyton Manning to dissect defenses with surgical efficiency. Moore's genius was subtle, his presence understated. Yet every Colts fan who marveled at Manning's audibles and precision owes a debt to Moore's meticulous teaching, or Dante Scarnecchia, the offensive line guru of the New England Patriots dynasty. Scarnecchia rarely appeared in headlines, but his craft turned mid-round draft picks and overlooked players into cohesive, disciplined units that protected Tom Brady year after year. His mastery of technique, his relentless attention to detail, allowed New England's passing game to thrive. He was not a head coach, not a face of the franchise, but without him, dynasties might have crumbled. Defensive visionaries deserve their place in this story as well. Coaches like Fritz Schirmer, who built unpredictable fronts and disguised coverages that forced quarterbacks into mistakes. Or Dick Butkus, who perfected the zone blitz, a defensive philosophy that confused protections and punished offenses. Butkus spent decades refining his scheme, rarely celebrated the way offensive gurus were. But his concepts are still studied, still copied, still haunting quarterbacks on Sundays. And yet, despite their impact, these men remained in the margins. Perhaps that is the nature of coaching. The players execute, the stars shine, while the architects remain behind clipboards and film reels. But make no mistake, football would not be what it is without them. There is something almost poetic about these hidden strategists. They were not chasing personal glory. Many of them never wanted the spotlight. What they craved was the perfection of a system, the thrill of solving the puzzle, the satisfaction of watching a concept born in the quiet of a film room explode into reality on the field. For them, the win was not just on the scoreboard, but in the symmetry of execution. The beauty of a well-timed play, the elegance of a defense anticipating every move. Imagine the hours spent in darkened rooms, film reels clicking, chalk scratching on blackboards. Coaches rewinding the same sequence over and over, looking for the slightest tell, the hidden weakness. Imagine them sketching plays by hand, testing alignments with salt shakers on a table, dreaming of ways to outmaneuver men stronger and faster than the ones they were coaching. This was their art. Their canvas was the field. Their brushstrokes were formations and adjustments. The modern NFL, with its fireworks of passing, its complex defenses, its chess match of audibles and disguises, is a living museum of their contributions. Every time a quarterback executes a quick three-step drop, every time a receiver cuts across the middle on a timed route, every time a defense sends a safety on a disguised blitz, you are watching the legacy of unsung coaching visionaries. But their greatest contribution might not even be the systems themselves. It was the mindset they instilled, that football is a game of imagination, that there is always a new angle, always a fresh wrinkle, always a way to push the boundaries. They taught that the game is never finished, that evolution is constant, that brilliance can come from anywhere. Some of them will never have busts in Canton. Some will never see their names etched in highlight reels. But without them, the game would have been stagnant, predictable, even dull. With them, it became what it is today, the most intricate, enthralling, and strategic sport in America. The unsung coaching visionaries built football's foundation brick by brick, idea by idea. They shaped the game from the shadows. Their names whispered among insiders, but rarely celebrated in public. And maybe that is fitting. For them, the joy was not in fame, but in the craft. In knowing that the players could shine brighter because the system was sound. In knowing that Sunday's spectacle was born on Monday's blackboard. As the game continues to evolve, as new offenses spread the field and defenses counter with speed and disguise, their influence lingers. The architects of strategy live on in every play, hidden yet eternal. They called it the hidden third of the game. Coaches whispered it. Analysts occasionally mentioned it, but fans rarely noticed. Special teams lived in the margins, away from the glamour of quarterbacks, running backs, and defensive stars. Yet in those overlooked moments between the opening whistle and the final kneel-down, special teams decided championships, rewrote rules, and produced players who, though forgotten today, left fingerprints across the history of the NFL. Picture the game before specialization. In the early decades, players often did everything. They lined up on offense, defense, and kicked the ball when needed. But as the league grew sharper, faster, and more complex, a new category of player emerged. The man who could punt a ball into the clouds, the athlete who could return a kick 90 yards with breathtaking speed, the kicker whose ice-cold nerves could silence entire stadiums. These were pioneers in a field few respected, but every coach knew was essential. Consider Lou Groza of the Cleveland Browns. Nicknamed the Toe, Groza was both an offensive tackle and a place kicker. In the 1950s, he shattered the notion that a kicker was a disposable afterthought. His accuracy and reliability gave Paul Brown's dynasty a lethal weapon. With Groza field position transformed, no longer was scoring limited to touchdowns. Every drive had the potential to produce points. It seems ordinary now, but in his time, Groza's precision was revolutionary. His kicks were not sideshows, they were daggers. Then there were the punters. Names like Ray Guy stand like monuments. Drafted by the Oakland Raiders in 1973, Guy was the first pure punter ever selected in the first round. Critics laughed at the decision. A punter worthy of such a high pick. But Al Davis knew what he had. Ray Guy didn't just punt the football, he weaponized it. With a leg like a cannon and uncanny hang time, he changed the geometry of the field. Coverage units suddenly had time to swarm returners. Opponents were pinned deep in their own territory. Field position, once an abstract concept, became a tangible force because Ray Guy existed. By the time his career ended, no one laughed at the idea of punters being game changers. Kick returners, too, emerged as gladiators in their own right. Gale Sayers, though primarily remembered as a dazzling halfback, electrified the league as a return man. His vision and acceleration made him untouchable, weaving through defenders as if he were dancing across another plane. A single return could flip a game, shifting momentum like an earthquake. Later, players like Billy White Shoes Johnson brought both flair and substance. His famous dances made headlines, but it was his ability to turn chaos into touchdowns that redefined the return game. But special teams were not just about stars. They were about unsung grinders. The players who built their careers covering kicks, blocking punts, and hustling in moments most fans used as bathroom breaks. Coaches like Bill Belichick, long before his New England dynasty, cut their teeth understanding this hidden third. In Cleveland, Belichick emphasized the importance of field position and special teams discipline. He knew games were often decided not by marquee plays, but by who controlled the margins. That philosophy never left him. One of the most pivotal moments in NFL history was born on special teams. Super Bowl III. Jets versus Colts. In a low-scoring duel, Jim Turner's 3 field goals provided critical separation. Without those kicks, Joe Namath's famous guarantee might have evaporated into myth. Another came decades later, Super Bowl XXXVI. The Patriots' unknown underdogs faced the St. Louis Rams' greatest show on turf, when Adam Vinatieri drilled a 48-yard field goal through the uprights as time expired. History was rewritten. Dynasty was born not on a pass or a run, but on the foot of a kicker. The rules evolved alongside these pioneers. Kickoffs once began from the 40-yard line. Returners had more space, more opportunity for fireworks. But as collisions grew more violent and injuries more severe, the league moved the ball back, then forward again, tweaking the mechanics to balance excitement with safety. The wedge-up brutal wall of blockers used on returns was outlawed. The league wanted to curb catastrophic hits. In doing so, it reshaped what it meant to be a return specialist. Gone were some of the wild, unrestrained sprints of old. In their place, a more strategic, precise form of return emerged. Yet even as rules changed, legends adapted. Devin Hester became perhaps the most feared returner the game has ever seen. His vision, acceleration, and uncanny timing turned special teams into a spectacle. Coaches altered entire game plans because of him. Kick it to Hester, and you risked disaster. In Super Bowl XLI, he delivered the opening kickoff back for a touchdown, a moment so explosive it remains etched in NFL lore. The hidden third of football had never felt so visible. Still, for every Hester, every Visionaries, every Ray guy, there were hundreds of men who played their entire careers in the shadows. The gunners sprinting downfield, bruised and battered, never touching the ball. The long snappers, whose names only appeared when something went wrong. The return blockers, the coverage anchors. The kick protection specialist strolls with no glory, no statistics, yet critical to victory. They embodied football's ethos, a team sport where every inch mattered. And through all of it, special teams forced the NFL to innovate. Coaches had to rethink risk and reward. Do you punt conservatively or gamble with a fake? Do you trust your kicker from 50 plus or push for one more first down? The answers often decided legacies. Mike Ditka's Bears in 1985 were defined by defense. But it was their fearless use of returners, like Willie Gault, that constantly set up field position. The difference between champions and forgotten contenders often came down to this overlooked unit. Today, as fans watch games, they often rise for touchdowns, gasp at interceptions, and cheer highlight catches. But beneath the surface, hidden in those transitional plays, lives a story that shaped the NFL itself. It is the story of men like Lou Groza, who proved a kicker could change history. Ray Guy, who turned punting into an art form. Devin Hester, who forced opponents into fear before the ball was even kicked. And countless unnamed players sprinting down fields, colliding at impossible speeds, sacrificing glory for the sake of the team. Special teams pioneers shaped football in ways fans rarely acknowledge. They taught the league that every snap mattered, every yard of field position was precious, and every chance to score could tip the balance of destiny. They lived in the shadows, yet carried the weight of victory. The hidden third of football was never truly hidden, it was just waiting for the right eyes to notice. These pioneers built legacies not in touchdowns or passing records, but in the quiet precision of field goals. The booming arc of punts, the electrifying chaos of a return, and the grit of forgotten collisions. They are the proof that football's greatness lies not only in its stars, but in its unsung architects, the men who mastered the overlooked moments and, in doing so, changed the game forever. In every great story about football, the spotlight almost always falls on the dazzling quarterback, the unstoppable running back, or the receiver who makes the impossible catch. But in the shadows, there has always been another breed of player. Men who thrived not in the light of glory, but in the chaos of silence. They were the defensive enforcers, the quiet hitmen who altered the course of games without ever demanding attention. Their job was not glamorous. It was brutal. It was unforgiving, and it was necessary. These were the men who moved like ghosts on the field, who struck with precision and force, then melted back into the shadows. For decades, their names were rarely etched into headlines. But their presence was unmistakable to anyone who dared step across the line of scrimmage. They were linebackers who read plays before they unfolded safeties, who turned the middle of the field into a killing ground cornerbacks, who made receivers fear every step of a route, and linemen who punished quarterbacks long after the ball was gone. To understand these quiet hitmen, you have to understand the DNA of defense itself. Offense in football is about imagination, artistry, and calculated risk. Defense is about violence controlled, force refined, and intimidation disguised. The best defensive enforcers weren't just physically strong, they were psychological weapons. They used silence as a tool, their very presence whispering a warning that every play could end in pain. Take the linebackers of the 1970s and 1980s. When rules offered less protection and the middle of the field was a no man's land. These were men like Jack Lambert, a skeletal figure with missing teeth who needed no words to terrify opponents. Lambert was not just a tackler, he was an executioner of plays, a man who made running backs hesitate before daring to enter his zone. His silence was deafening because everyone on the field knew exactly what was coming. One step too slow, one cut too predictable, and you would be swallowed whole. Or Ronnie Lott, the safety who transformed the secondary into a minefield. He didn't dance for cameras or bask in celebrations. Hit with such ferocity that receivers considered short gains victories simply because they survived contact. Lott lost part of a finger during his career, and instead of taking time off, he chose to amputate and keep playing. That decision wasn't made for glory. It was made because football was war, and enforcers do not leave the battlefield. These men redefined intimidation not through words, but through actions. They did not need to taunt. They did not need to boast. They let every tackle, every crushing blow, and every perfectly timed hit deliver their message. And the message was simple. In this game, survival is earned. The brilliance of these defensive enforcers was that they rarely sought the spotlight. They understood that their craft was not about personal statistics, but about altering the psychology of an entire offense. A quarterback who feared the blindside rusher released the ball a second too early. A wide receiver who feared the lurking safety cut a route short. These were not just hits. They were echoes that rippled through the game, changing outcomes in ways that never showed up in the box score. In silence, they shaped the strategy of football. The West Coast offense, famous for short, quick passes, was not simply born out of creative play calling. It was a survival mechanism. Quarterbacks like Joe Montana and Bill Walsh's scheme thrived in part because defensive enforcers were making the deep game too dangerous. The physical violence of defenses forced offenses to evolve. In that way, the unsung hitmen of defense may have done more to shape the modern game than many of the stars celebrated in highlight reels. But there was always a cost. Enforcers absorbed punishment as much as they delivered it. The very essence of their role demanded that they sacrifice their bodies, their futures, and often their health for the team. Many left the game broken, carrying injuries that would haunt them long after the cheers faded. Their silence carried on into retirement, as countless former enforcers suffered in obscurity, while the stars they once protected or punished lived in the glow of fame. This raises a difficult truth. The NFL was built on their backs, yet history has too often relegated them to footnotes. We celebrate offensive legends because their numbers are easy to track, their highlights replayed endlessly. But the quiet hitmen of defense were architects of fear, engineers of chaos, and guardians of championships. Without them, dynasties crumble, legends falter, and history changes course. Imagine the Chicago Bears of 1985 without Mike Singletary's burning eyes scanning the field, diagnosing every play. Picture the Pittsburgh Steelers without Mel Blount, a cornerback so physically dominant that the league had to change its rules to stop him. These were not just players, they were forces of nature, quiet storms that wrecked everything in their path. Yet the silence of these men was not weakness, it was strength. They embraced anonymity because they understood the deeper truth of football. It is not a game won in the spotlight, but in the shadows. It is not about who scores, but about who prevents the other team from believing they can. And so, decade after decade, the defensive enforcers carried on their work. They bent the rules when necessary, skirted the edges of legality, and did what had to be done to keep their teams alive. They were ghosts haunting the field, and in their silence, they spoke louder than any touchdown celebration ever could. Today, in an era of highlight packages and instant fame, their role has become harder to see. Rules have softened the game. Hits that once defined careers are now flagged, penalized, and punished. But the echoes of the enforcers remain. Every safety who dares to deliver a bone-shattering hit, every linebacker who prowls the field with silent menace carries their legacy. The story of football cannot be told without them. They were the men who thrived in shadows, who left their mark in silence, who bent games with invisible hands. They were the defensive enforcers, the quiet hitmen who altered games in ways numbers will never capture. Their names may not all be remembered, but their impact lives forever in the DNA of the sport. And every time a receiver glances nervously over his shoulder, every time a quarterback hears footsteps that may not even be there. It is their ghost, their echo, their presence that still haunts the game. Because in football, silence is not absence. Silence is power. And no one understood that better than the men who built their careers on enforcing it. They stand on the sideline, helmets in hand, their eyes locked on the field, yet hidden in the shadows. The camera rarely finds them. Broadcasters rarely speak their names, and fans hardly remember their numbers. They are backup quarterbacks, the forgotten field generals of the NFL. Their careers are built not on constant glory, but on endless preparation for a moment that may never come. Yet when that moment does arrive, when the starter falls and the crowd gasps, it is often the backup who must steady the ship, carry the weight, and keep the season alive. In the mythology of football, we celebrate the great leaders, the Bradys, the Montanas, the Mannings. But just beneath that surface exists a quieter fraternity of men who trained just as hard, studied just as long, and often sacrificed just as much, all while knowing they may never get more than a handful of snaps. These backups are not failures. They are unsung guardians, standing watch over a team's future, waiting to be called into chaos. Their story is one of resilience, humility, and fleeting chances to seize immortality. To understand their importance, one must first appreciate the brutality of the game. Quarterbacks, no matter how tough, are not immune to the violence of football. Bones break, ligaments tear, concussions strike without warning. When a starter goes down, the backup is not stepping into a friendly environment. He is walking into the fire with defenders hungry to exploit any weakness. For a backup, there is no warm-up, no easing in. It is immediate pressure, immediate judgment, immediate legacy. Consider the story of Earl Morrall, perhaps the greatest backup quarterback in NFL history. For years, Morrall drifted from team to team, always reliable, never flashy. Then, in 1968, fate struck. Johnny Unitas, the face of the Baltimore Colts, was injured. Morrall, already in his 30s, stepped in and guided the Colts to a 13-1 record, earning league MVP honors. 2 years later, when Unitas faltered again, it was Morrall who carried the team deep into the playoffs. Later, with Miami, he once more stepped into the breach, this time protecting the only perfect season in NFL history. Morrall did not wear the crown of a superstar, but his fingerprints are on some of the greatest teams the sport has ever seen. He was a backup who refused to let the story die. Or look at Jeff Hostetler in 1990. For years, he languished behind Phil Simms on the New York Giants roster, barely noticed, rarely trusted. But late that season, when Simms went down with an injury, Hostetler stepped into the huddle with the entire weight of New York on his shoulders. Against all odds, he played with poise and resilience, leading the Giants to victory in Super Bowl 25. In that moment, he was not a backup. He was a champion, forever etched into the fabric of the game. These men remind us that greatness can bloom in unexpected soil. The backup role is not glamorous. It demands swallowing one's ego, accepting invisibility, and preparing for a stage that might never arrive. Yet those who embrace it often become the quiet heartbeat of a team, ready to preserve order in the face of chaos. Even in recent memory, we see echoes of this story. Nick Foles spent most of his career overlooked, traded, even doubted. But when the Philadelphia Eagles lost Carson Wentz late in the 2017 season, it was Foles who stepped in. He did more than steady the team. He delivered one of the greatest playoff runs in NFL history, culminating in a Super Bowl victory over Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. In that single stretch, a career backup became a legend, reminding the world that football's heroes are not always the ones we expect. But for every Foles, Morrall, or Hostetler, there are countless others who never get their shot. Men whose careers consist of endless practices, endless clipboard notes, endless waiting. They hold film sessions late into the night, dissecting defenses with the intensity of generals, knowing full well they may never step into battle. They stand on the sideline, whispering advice to the starter, serving as extra eyes and ears. They are teachers, strategists, and moral support rolled into one. They sacrifice their own dreams of fame for the good of the team. Yet this life takes its toll. Many backups retire without fanfare, their names fading into obscurity. Some drift into coaching, others into ordinary life. Few are remembered, yet their teammates know their value. Ask any starter, and they will tell you having a strong backup is not a luxury. It is survival. There is also a unique psychological weight to being a backup. Imagine spending your entire career training to be the best, only to be told your job is to wait, to practice every throw, every read, every audible, but to live with the knowledge that someone else will always start ahead of you. It requires humility, but also a constant state of readiness. Backups cannot afford to be unprepared. If their moment arrives and they fail, there may never be a second chance. In many ways, the backup embodies the essence of football itself: perseverance, sacrifice, and brotherhood. They are the embodiment of the team-first mentality, proof that glory is not always measured in touchdowns or trophies. Sometimes it is measured in patience, in preparation, in being ready when fate calls your number. The forgotten field generals may never dominate highlight reels, but their stories are laced throughout the history of the NFL. They are the ones who steadied legendary teams in their darkest hours, who protected dynasties from collapse, who reminded us that every man on the roster matters. Without them, seasons would crumble, history would shift, and legends might never have been born. So the next time you see a quarterback standing silently on the sideline, helmet tucked under his arm, remember this: he is not just waiting. He is studying, preparing, living with the possibility that at any moment the fate of his team could rest entirely in his hands. And when that moment arrives, the forgotten backup has the chance to become unforgettable. They are not failures. They are survivors. They are insurance policies and secret weapons. They are reminders that football is bigger than stars, bigger than names, bigger than the spotlight. The game is built on depth, on trust, and on the quiet courage of men who may never get the glory, but who are always ready to step into it. For in the NFL, history is not just written by the champions who start the season. Sometimes it is written by the backups who save it. The middle of the field has never been empty space. It is a strip of ground where courage is measured and where doubt takes root. For decades, it was a haunted corridor patrolled by men who were more than tacklers. They were the shadows that lived between the guardrails of a game built on force. Linebackers made it their territory. They erased confidence, punished hesitation, and reminded everyone that crossing the heart of a defense had a price. In a league shaped by contact and by the rule changes that contact demanded, no role carried more menace or influence than the linebacker at full stride. To watch them work was to see football reduced to its most primal truth. Intimidation took form. Punishment arrived on time. At first, the position did not exist in the way we know it. Early teams stacked the line and trusted safeties to clean up the rest. As strategy evolved, coaches realized they needed someone who could live in the space behind the line yet in front of the deep patrol. The position was born from necessity and then grew as the sport learned how valuable disruption could be. The best linebackers were quick enough to chase, disciplined enough to diagnose, and ruthless enough to leave a mark. Their job description became simple: get everyone to the ball, get there first, arrive with bad intentions. By the 1960s and 1970s, the linebacker was no longer a label. He was a presence. Quarterbacks learned to scan the secondary and then check the middle, because that was where decisions became dangerous. Dick Butkus crouched low, helmet tilted forward, and turned crossing routes into cautionary tales. Ray Nitschke glared through the bars of his mask and imposed a standard for violence inside the tackle box. Jack Lambert stalked the stem of every route and treated the center of the field as personal ground. These men did not just tackle. They ended plays in ways that forced the sport to ask what it was willing to allow. The league began to confront the reality that some collisions were too severe to ignore. Clothesline tackles faded from the game. Spearing with the crown of the helmet drew new attention. What looked like raw toughness in one decade became prohibited technique in the next. In many cases, linebackers pushed that conversation to the front. They delivered the hits that made the public gasp and made officials reach for flags. The sport did not soften out of preference. It adjusted because the second level had become a zone of wreckage. The power of the linebacker shadow was never only in force. It was in psychology. Receivers developed what coaches called alligator arms. They heard footsteps and shortened their reach, choosing survival over extension. Running backs jab-stepped at the hole and paused a fraction because they knew a shoulder was arriving to meet them. Quarterbacks flinched and moved to their checkdowns. Not because the coverage was perfect, but because the hit on a slant was not worth the risk. These small changes did not show up on the stat sheet. They lived in the rhythm of the game. They lived in the way a coordinator called plays, and in the way a route runner braced his ribs before the ball ever left the hand. Film rooms became confessionals for fear. Coaches ran the tape back and watched a receiver blink before contact. A linebacker had already done his work days earlier by building a reputation. The result was a pass thrown a hair outside. The result was a slight turn of the head that cost the offense a first down. Linebackers understood that outcomes could be shaped before the snap. Alignment became a message. A step forward toward the A-gap forced a protection change. A wide shade over a tight end killed an easy release. The shadow extended across pre-snap math and into the language of audibles. Then came the disruptors who rewrote what the position could be. Lawrence Taylor exploded off the edge and made offenses redesign protection. He is most often remembered as an outside rusher, but his example belongs here because he proved that a linebacker could unmake an offensive plan by presence alone. Opponents adjusted splits. They chipped with backs. They rewired progressions so that throws left a hand before havoc arrived. Protection rules evolved, and the concept of in the grasp gained weight. Because the league had to preserve its quarterbacks, Taylor proved that speed and fury at the second level could force pens to move inside the rulebook. Inside the hash marks in the same era, Mike Singletary stood like a metronome for the Chicago defense. Eyes wide, feet quiet until the ball moved. He diagnosed plays so quickly that runs died before they lived. Crossing routes felt shorter when he was in the neighborhood. Offenses built their timing around his patience. He was proof that brilliance at linebacker was not only a matter of collision, it was a matter of knowing, of arriving at the correct square in the exact second before the ball carrier did. The 1990s and 2000s brought a new generation of enforcers who mixed range with impact. Ray Lewis commanded a defense with voice and with force. He knifed through seams, met backs at full speed, and set a tone that carried through broadcasts and into living rooms. Brian Urlacher dropped from the middle into deep coverage and turned the Tampa 2 into a philosophy that dared quarterbacks to throw above his head. Zach Thomas Reed pulls and counters like a librarian reading a favorite page. Junior so chased everything that moved and played with a joy that masked how many plays ended in controlled violence. Their reputations changed play calls. They sat under the crossers and forced offenses to pick at the edges. The middle belonged to them until a flag said otherwise. Safety became a larger part of the discussion. The league defined the defenseless receiver. It emphasized hits to the held and illegal use of the helmet. The horse collar tackle drew a specific ban after a series of injuries. None of these rules were written in a vacuum. They arrived because the second level had become the place where angles turned into wrecks. The goals shifted from managing chaos to protecting the players who risked their bodies within it. Even in that shift, the role of the linebacker remained central. The great ones adapted. They lowered their strike zone. They tackled through the hips instead of through the helmet. They learned to separate ball from body without drawing a flag. The message stayed the same. The technique changed. Modern linebackers refined the art further. Patrick Willis closed space as if distance did not exist. Luke Kuechly saw routes before they unfolded and spoke the answers into his huddle. Bobby Wagner balanced range with a steady patience that kept his defense calm. They were students and enforcers in the same breath. They understood spacing concepts and then punished anyone who walked into those spaces. They lived in a world with stricter boundaries and still made the middle feel dangerous. The shadow adapted rather than faded. Strategy shifted with them. Offenses moved to spread alignments and empty formations to pull linebackers wide. They leaned into option concepts to make second-level defenders choose wrong. They threw more quick game to avoid the collision waiting 5 yards down the field. Each adjustment was a nod to the power of the role. If a single player in the middle could delete confidence, the answer was to pull him into space and dilute his influence. Coordinators did not say it aloud, but their call sheets admitted the truth. The path through a defense is easiest where the enforcer is not. The best defenses answered with disguise. They walked linebackers into the line and then bailed them at the snap. They mugged both the gaps and forced frantic protection calls. They rotated safeties down late and asked a linebacker to carry a seam like a safety would. The second level became a hall of mirrors. Quarterbacks were asked to solve a puzzle, while knowing that wrong answers carried a physical penalty. The shadow did not rely on thunder alone. It relied on doubt. The legacy of rule shaping continued. Teaching tapes changed. Coaches stopped praising knockout blows. They taught strike zone tackles and eyes-up contact. They drilled leverage and angles that finished plays without launching. At the same time, they preserved the edge that defined the position. The job was still to arrive fast and arrive with purpose. It was still to make the middle of the field a place of calculation rather than comfort. For fans who lived through earlier eras, the memory of the old collisions still lingers. They remember receivers folding after a high crossing route. They remember quarterbacks who flinched at their third read, because the second read was a body check waiting near the hash. The sport has moved forward, but those echoes give the modern game its context. When a linebacker times a hit between the numbers and jars, the ball free without drawing a flag, the play feels like a proof of concept. The position can protect the head and still protect the territory. The paradox remains. Linebackers who patrol the middle with near illegal ferocity are both condemned and celebrated. They force the league to change. They made Sundays safer by making Saturdays in the competition committee more urgent. They also gave the game its edge. They kept football from becoming a track meet in helmets. Every new guideline that protects a receiver also testifies to the power of the men who once waited for him with shoulders set and feet braced. If the NFL is an argument about how much risk a spectacle can hold, the linebacker is the part of the argument that keeps everyone honest. He proves that toughness can live with technique. He proves that intimidation can exist without recklessness. He proves that rules can evolve and still leave room for the heartbeat that makes football what it is. The middle of the field remains a test because the men who guard it refuse to let it be easy. The names change. The stakes do not. A quarterback takes a breath and glances inside. A receiver tenses for contact he has not yet felt. A coordinator weighs a slant against a swing and chooses the swing. Somewhere, a linebacker smiles. The shadow has done its work before the ball ever moves. The story of football has always been told in yards and inches, in points and possessions, in trophies raised under the blinding light of victory. But underneath the numbers and the records lies something more complicated, something far less polished than the highlight reels suggest. This game has been built not just by rules, but by those who dared to test them. It has been shaped by pioneers who bent the edges of legality, innovators who blurred the line between brilliance and deceit, and enforcers who risked everything to impose their will on opponents. What we call football today is, in many ways, the direct product of rule breakers. When we rewind to the earliest decades, the NFL was little more than organized chaos. A new sport still deciding what it wanted to be. In that lawless environment, moves that would later be labeled as illegal were not only tolerated but celebrated. Head slaps, clothesline tackles, chop blocks, and hidden ball tricks gave the sport a primal energy that drew crowds and created legends. These tactics were not simply about breaking rules. They were about survival in a game where limits had not yet been written. As the decades rolled forward, the NFL became bigger, faster, and more scrutinized. With every illegal tactic that made headlines, the league responded with a new rule, a new guideline, a new definition of what was acceptable. Yet here lies the irony. Every time the league closed a door, players found a window. Every time a loophole was sealed, someone discovered another. This dance between innovation and regulation has defined the NFL more than any single era of dominance or dynasty of teams. Consider how deception became artistry. Trick, plays like the flea flicker, the fake punt, or the hidden receiver were born in an era when misdirection often crossed the line of legality. Some of those early attempts vanished under the weight of new rulebooks. Others evolved into staples of today's game. It is no exaggeration to say that football's creativity was sharpened by the constant tension between what was legal and what players could get away with. Then there were the enforcers, the men whose very reputations thrived on intimidation. They operated in the gray space between hard-nosed football and outright violence. The forearm shivers, the brutal head slaps, the late hits that once drew cheers from the crowd are now relics of a past the NFL would rather forget. Yet without those tactics, the league would never have been forced to confront player safety, concussions, and the long-term cost of violence. The illegal moves of yesterday forced football into a moral reckoning, one that continues today with every new study on head trauma and every adjustment to tackling rules. But not all rule breakers left scars. Some left blueprints. Offensive innovators who pushed the boundaries of legal formations and motion rules gave rise to the spread offense, the West Coast system, and the fast-paced schemes that dominate the modern game. Defensive architects who once exploited illegal tactics forced the league to redefine pass interference, holding, and contact rules. The very chess match we see on Sundays. Coaches scanning play sheets, quarterbacks reading defenses, corners shadowing receivers, exists because of battles fought in gray areas that no longer exist. The fascinating truth is this: the illegal and the legal are not opposites in football. They are partners in evolution. What was once outlawed often became tomorrow's strategy, rewritten under the light of acceptance. What was once celebrated often became outlawed when its cost grew too high. The history of the NFL is not a straight line of progress, but a zigzag of experiments, accidents, and daring plays that forced the league to constantly redefine itself. Today, the NFL markets itself as the pinnacle of fair competition, where rules protect both integrity and safety. But deep down, fans know the truth. They remember the legendary rule benders, the quarterbacks who perfected the pump fake, the cornerbacks who tugged just enough jersey to avoid a flag, the linemen who disguised a hold with perfect subtlety. These small acts of rebellion still exist in every game, hidden in plain sight. They are the whispers of football's past, reminders that bending the rules has always been part of mastering the sport. And what of tomorrow? History is any guide. The NFL will continue to evolve because players will continue to push. New technology, new analytics, and new training methods will create athletes faster and stronger than ever before. With them will come new ways to stretch the boundaries, new tactics that test what is fair and what is forbidden. The league will respond, as it always has, with adjustments, penalties, and revisions. But the cycle will never truly end. The legacy of illegal moves is not shame. It is influence. It is a testament to the restless creativity of athletes who refuse to be confined. It is proof that football's beauty has always lived at the edge of chaos. Every cutback run, every blindside block, every desperate lateral is haunted by a century of players who tested the line between order and rebellion. And every fan who stands in a stadium or on a couch knows, even if only subconsciously, that the game would not be as thrilling without the ghosts of those who dared to break it. In the end, football is not perfect, never has been. But perhaps that is its enduring power. For every illegal tactic that has been buried in the past, a new innovation has risen to take its place. For every controversy that has shaken the league, a new era of clarity has followed. The NFL's history of rule breaking is not a stain, but a signature. It tells us that greatness does not come from playing safe within the boundaries, but from challenging them, stretching them, and sometimes paying the price for crossing them. So the next time you watch a perfectly executed play, a quarterback threading a ball between defenders, a wide receiver toe-tapping along the sideline, a linebacker, timing his blitz to perfection, remember that these moments are not just products of discipline and training. They are the descendants of rebellion. They are the polished children of chaos. They exist because, once upon a time, someone decided to do something the rulebook said they could not. And maybe that is the ultimate truth of this game. Football, like life, thrives in the tension between rules and freedom, between what is written and what is imagined. Its illegal moves have never been just mistakes or fouls. They have been catalysts. They have been sparks. They have been the friction that kept the engine of innovation burning. The NFL is what it is today, not in spite of its rule breakers, but because of them.